Michael Bradley. The Iceman Inheritance. Prehistoric Sources of Western Man's Racism, Sexism, and Aggression. With a new introduction by John Henrik Clark. KU Publications, Ltd. Greek Gifts, Western Technology. This book is racist. For, among other things, I will attempt to show that racism itself is a predisposition of but one race of mankind, the white race. I believe that I can show that our converging contemporary crises, like racism itself, have their origins in the prehistory of the white race alone. We attribute various threats to our survival to man's folly, but this is a conscious and self-protecting euphemism. Nuclear war, environmental pollution, resource rape. All are primary threats to our survival, and all are the result of peculiarly Caucasoid behavior, Caucasoid values, Caucasoid psychology. There is no way to avoid the truth. The problem with the world is white men. If this insight has generally escaped us, it is only because we Caucasoids have dictated much history, written most of it, and judged it in terms of our own self-image. But we have never looked at ourselves in an objective biological mirror, and that is what we shall now proceed to do. Our racial psychology has brought the world to the brink of disaster. We therefore have some obligation to attempt to correct matters, and there isn't much time. The task is a hopeless vanity. Fort Detrick, Maryland, Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and Dugway Proving Grounds, Utah, CBW Research Installations. Thanks to experiments at Fort Detrick, Rocky Mountain spotted fever now appears in New England, and Venezuelan equine encephalitis occurs among wildlife in the southeastern states. Both are CBW experimental strains. In September of 1976, researchers learned that bubonic plague is present among Colorado wildlife in the vicinity of Rocky Mountain Arsenal, where that agent is stored. Recent evidence raises the ominous possibility that CBW research may have already promoted a massive Clostridium epidemic among U.S. domestic cattle. Over the past 3 years, some 1,500 cattle in 22 American states have been found mysteriously mutilated. Mutilated is a misnomer. The dead cattle have been found with selected organs and tissues surgically removed, and the organs and tissues in question are usually those needed to determine Clostridium infection. Of all mutilated cattle later autopsied, some 40% have been found to be infected with Clostridium bacteria. The mysterious mutilators, whoever they are, apparently use military helicopters, and the conclusion is becoming inescapable that they must enjoy government protection since the mutilators are never revealed by official searches. It is as if some government agency were attempting to monitor the extent and virulence of a still secret, but widespread, Clostridium epidemic. It only remains to be said that there are 93 species of the Clostridium bacteria genus. Several species are CBW research agents, particularly C. botulinum. It seems that medicine as one proof of progress is rapidly losing lives in the struggle against other aspects of progress. Medicine cannot be considered a vindication of rampant progress. Rather, medicine is rapidly becoming an inadequate defense against it. Our military activities, purposeful and accidental, are not the only threats our culture presents to the rest of the world. Even our peaceful activities are proving harmful. A report prepared by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency in 1974, designated Office of Political Research, 401, attempts to assess the political and social implications of climatic change. The report notes that although there appear to be natural cycles of climatic change, and the world appears to be entering a natural period of cooling, man-made industrial pollution in the atmosphere must now be regarded as a major contributing factor to the severity and rapidity of climate alteration. The CIA estimated that from 20 to 30% of all atmospheric dust is now man-made. This unnatural addition of dust has two effects. The first is the enhancement of the greenhouse effect and contributes to warming of the Earth's surface. But the second and much greater effect is a reduction in the amount of sunlight which reaches the Earth's surface. The dust reflects more sunlight back into space. The net result of these two effects is a distinct cooling of the Earth's surface, and climatologists have already concluded that it is having an adverse, and possibly irreversible, influence upon global weather patterns. Wind patterns which we once regarded as normal have, in the northern hemisphere, shifted southward by an average of about 30 miles since 1940. The average annual temperature in Iceland has dropped almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1945. The growing season in the British Isles has been reduced by a week. The tropics have not gone unaffected by the southerly shift of wind patterns. Since 1950, the desiccating winds of northern Africa have shifted southward, and the Sahara Desert has expanded to encroach on the once arable lands of the Sahel. The resulting famine in sub-Saharan Africa has been a world tragedy for the past decade. The monsoons have failed twice since 1964, visiting famine upon the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. Soviet crops failed in 1972. The CIA report lists the adverse climatic changes of the early 1970s tersely. The world's snow and ice cover had increased by at least 10 to 15%. In the eastern Canadian area of Arctic Greenland, below normal temperatures were recorded for 19 consecutive months for the first time in 100 years. The Moscow region suffered its worst drought in 300 to 500 years. Drought occurred in Central America, the Sub-Sahara, South Asia, China, and Australia. Massive floods took place in the Midwestern United States. The implications of climatic change are staggering. Europe, presently with an annual mean temperature of 12 degrees centigrade, supports 3 persons per arable hectare. But an average temperature of only 1 degree centigrade less would mean that only 2 persons per arable hectare could be supported, and that more than 20% of the population could not be fed from domestic sources. In China, the picture is much worse. China presently supports 7 persons per arable hectare at the present annual mean temperature. A decline in the average temperature of 1 degree centigrade would mean, in China, that only 4 persons per arable hectare could be supported. Greek gifts, Western psychology and philosophy. Perhaps even worse than specific and very real threats which Caucasoid behavior has posed to the non-white peoples of the world is the worldwide establishment of Caucasoid civilization and values, which has transformed almost all of our planet into one dingy monoculture. Belgian anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss maintains that the Indians of the Americas died out because of cultural poisoning more than anything else. In Tristes Tropiques, Lévi-Strauss writes, in what used to be called Hispaniola, today Haiti and Santo Domingo, the native population numbered about 100,000 in 1492, but had dropped to 200 about a century later, since people died of horror and disgust at European civilization even more than of smallpox and physical ill treatment. Our progress has succeeded in blanketing the entire world in a dreary and anti-human monoculture which consists of very real threats to human survival as well as mere ugliness. Again, Lévi-Strauss writes, now that the Polynesian islands have been smothered in concrete and turned into aircraft carriers solidly anchored in our economic system, when the whole of Asia is assuming the appearance of a European suburb, when the bidonvilles are spreading over the whole of Africa, when civil and military aviation blight the primeval beauty of the American or Oceanian forests, even before they have been destroyed altogether, it would be a poor sort of evasion to pretend that by such means the human race could, as we say, better itself. Western psychology and philosophy. Perhaps we've indulged in this normal kind of conflict a bit more than other races, but not much more. It is in the sphere of abnormal violence that we Caucasoids excel among races. The Caucasoid domain has witnessed far more than its fair share of philosophical and religious conflict. Waves of competing beliefs sweeping from the Urals to the Atlantic, from the Sahara to the Baltic, clashing in dins of merciless racial fratricide, and leaving flotsam of broken bodies and swirling eddies of blood testifying to the violence of Caucasoid intellectual paroxysms. Intellectual violence is statistically rare among other races. Intellectual violence is typical of Caucasoids. Our wars of religion, our Inquisition, our philosophical conflicts have no parallel among yellow, red, brown, or black men. It is this kind of violence that makes our history appear senseless to other men, and senseless and baffling even to ourselves. There are paradoxes in man. In fact, from a biological point of view, man is a paradox. Men of other races have shown themselves capable of accepting the paradoxes of human existence. We Caucasoids possess a uniquely inadequate psychology in this regard. We are unable to accept paradoxes and inconsistencies. For us, they become conflicts. We are uniquely incapable of coping with intellectual conflicts and paradoxes within our own minds, and we cannot tolerate dissension in others. Men of other races are cognizant of the paradoxes of human existence and have responded to them in various ways. Some have responded by embracing asceticism. Some have preferred the Epicurean solution. But, with few exceptions among non-Caucasoid societies, there has been an almost complete social consensus on the proper response to the human paradox, or opposing solutions have been mutually tolerant and have coexisted side by side. But not for us. After thousands of years of racial existence, we Caucasoids have still not arrived at any consensus as to the appropriate response to the paradox of human existence, nor have we been able to develop any significant degree of tolerance for differing responses. Our abnormal and uniquely racial history has been characterized by dualistic, antithetical conflicts. At base, all our dualistic conflicts are one, a struggle between the spiritual and material aspects of human existence. Later, we will give the terms spiritual and material meaningful biological definitions. The history of the West and the Caucasoids is merely this one struggle endlessly repeated under different guises and labels, different heraldry, and different uniforms. We fought over the spiritual or material nature of Christ. The Church has endlessly fought the Gnosis. The Christians fought the Cathars. Science fought religion. Protestants fought Catholics. The Allies fought the Nazis. The free world fights communism yet. Caucasoid history is illuminated by pyres on which the losers, the heretics, writhe. Yet, considering that we will discover that all this violence is merely symptomatic of our psychological inadequacy in dealing with an easily understood and rather mundane biological fact, all the pyres stand revealed as a monstrous vanity. Since human existence is a paradox in biological terms, Western philosophy is inadequate because Western man cannot cope with paradox. The weakness is revealed at all levels of our thought. This weakness is alienation, either from one truth of the paradox or the other. We have to separate things. We have achieved freedom of the individual only at the cost of natural knowledge of belonging in the world, at the cost of being alone in the cosmos. Democracy is a form of government that assumes distrust on the part of the governed, dishonesty on the part of the government. Our checks and balances presuppose no trusting or fitting relationship between leaders and followers, no mutually beneficial pact. And before we become so enthusiastic about exporting democracy to those yet without it, we might pause to consider that it has never been a form of government comparable in longevity to monarchy. Even specifically Western populations have shown a decided penchant for preferring the personal bond of feudalism to the inherent distrust implied by democratic checks and balances. The innate dignity or worth of an alienated individual, to himself, to his society, or to his environment, is questionable at best. This is not to say that there is anything inherently bad about Western philosophy, but there is certainly nothing inherently good about it either. At best, Western philosophy is a rough and ready modus vivendi for uniquely Caucasoid psychology. At worst, it can be the justification for unleashing conflicts of dualistic intolerance among people who were previously innocent of them. Generally, when such conflicts have been induced in men of other races, they have borrowed some tenets of Western philosophy, one half of a dualism, in order to defend themselves against the missing half, represented by other aspects of Western philosophy, that we have imposed upon them. Child of fire and ice. I do not pretend to be the first person to propose a racial explanation for the obvious differences in behavior between white men and other people. Many have previously tested men of various colors in order to determine if a racial difference in intelligence, for example, might conveniently account for Western man's dominant technology and for the imposition of his culture throughout the world. Unfortunately for our self-image, and inconveniently, tests have never proven that innate intelligence differs significantly among races. There is a difference in brain size among races, however. Caucasoid cranial capacities average about 50 cubic centimeters more than Negroid cranial capacities, but Mongoloid cranial capacities have been found to average 150 cubic centimeters greater than the white man's, and this discovery did not do our egos any good. Thwarted by objective comparative test results, the Nazis rejected science and embraced pseudoscience in order to retain some basis for their mystique of race superiority. For the Nazis, the white man was uniquely created from cosmic struggle. Hans Horbiger, chief scientist of the Third Reich, developed his theory of fire and ice, a theory totally at odds with the view of cosmic and human evolution developed by contemporary Western science. Horbiger taught that all cosmic bodies except the Earth are made of ice. He believed that the Earth had 4 moons during its history, and that the collision of these moons with the Earth accounted for the presence of various human races. The white race was the result of the most recent collision. The Nazis were wrong. They built upon a myth. I will attempt to replace their myth with biological fact. However, there is a curious irony about the Nazi myth. It is ironic that I will also attempt to show that the white race developed in a unique environment of fire and ice. Caucasoid peoples do, in fact, seem to have originated in the Caucasus or in South Russia, and it is known that some tribal linguistic groups emerged from that area and invaded Europe, India, and parts of the Middle East. But this memory, although ancient, is still much too young to stretch back to the beginnings of the white race. The Nazi Germanic fire and ice myths must be coincidence. Coincidence? Strange as it may seem, it can be said accurately enough in an allegorical way that the Caucasoids did develop in the conflict between fire and ice. But it had nothing to do with Horbiger's pseudoscientific cosmology. We will find our inheritance of fire and ice if we return to the beginning of the Chronos complex at a grave at Le Moustier. It is not mythical, but too mundane. We will find cave fires which allowed one group of men to survive the ice of Wormi. The Caucasoids, uniquely among the races of mankind, evolved in a glacial environment. There is an increasing body of scientific data suggesting that this group of men did develop in a narrow zone of life between fire and ice, between the cave fires and the savage cold of the Worm Ice Age. I will attempt to show that glacial evolution demanded certain special adaptations of Neanderthal man, and that present-day Caucasoids still show vestiges of these adaptations. These special adaptations had incidental side effects which resulted in an exceptionally aggressive psychology, an extreme expression of the Chronos complex, and a higher level of psychosexual conflict compared to all other races of men. Not intelligence, nor morality, nor spirit, but aggression is responsible for the white man's superiority. Aggression is responsible for the expansion of Caucasoids, both geographically and culturally, at the expense of other races. We witnessed the final act of this expansion in our own time. It began when the glaciers retreated, when Worm released the white race from its tutelage under fire and ice, when pathological temporal aggression was unleashed upon the world. This higher level of aggression, which is merely an incidental result of glacial evolution, has fueled extreme manifestations of temporal assertion and defense among Caucasoids. Rampant technology, environmental pollution, resource rapine, and the threat of nuclear war are the results. I will also try to show that the white race's apparent inability to cope well with intellectual conflict, to cope non-violently with paradox, stems from psychosexual frustrations. We have a low frustration tolerance because glacial adaptation robbed us of sufficiently effective sexual displacement activities. Our philosophical and religious conflicts are the result of a glacial distortion of primate behavior patterns. All the pyres are a monstrous vanity. What about our superiority? Did our glacial evolution, unique among men, and our responsive adaptations serve to make us superior, however accidentally? Yes and no. There is nothing innate or eternal about superiority and inferiority. Both are dictated by external conditions. External conditions can change. Superiority and inferiority can trade places in an instant. It has happened before. It is happening now. During the Miocene, the Earth was largely covered with luxurious forests. 2 major lines of advanced primates coexisted, ape-tending pongids and man-tending hominids. During the epoch of Miocene green mansions, the pongids were, by every objective criterion, superior to the hominids. The apes proliferated mightily and spread all over the globe. Hominids were well down the road to extinction. Pongids eagerly adapted to the forest world, while we hominids remained stubbornly primitive. There is little room for doubt that if the Miocene had lasted longer, the hominids would have perished entirely. But it did not last. The Miocene became the Pliocene. Neither the pongids nor the hominids had the least responsibility for the change. The world's climate altered. The Earth entered a drought millions of years long. Forests dwindled and the pongids dwindled with them. By the sheerest accident, hominid liabilities in the Miocene became assets during the Pliocene. It is often said that our failure to adapt to the forests left our adaptational options open for the new environmental conditions of the Pliocene. It is truer to say that the conditions of the Pliocene happened to favor our primitive characteristics. Man is a primitive and unspecialized primate. It is natural to assume unconsciously that the hominids possessed some sort of innate superiority, which made man's present preeminence inevitable. Nonsense. The hominids merely possessed characteristics which were manifestly inferior during the Miocene, but which happened to suit the new environment of the Pliocene. Animal activity, so that it would serve the interests of territorial identity in the new dimension of time. We found that we could limit the future with more brutal warfare than anything known in the animal world. We could hurt the future, cripple it with casualties, and thereby compromise its ability to surpass us. Surpassing the past and limiting the future. That is the tension and essential pattern of human history. In the final pages of the Chronos complex, a biological analysis of our contemporary apocalypse was sketched. In simple biological terms, past surpassing activities have been united with future limiting ones. The merger represents a quantum jump in the power of the present. The merger was inevitable at a certain level of technology. Technology and progress were recently discovered to have inherent future limiting possibilities. Resource wastage and environmental pollution can cripple the future's ability to surpass the achievements of the present controlling lifetime. They are conscious attacks on the future in the interests of present identity assertion. Technology has now, for the first time, provided the present with a weapon capable of limiting the future totally: nuclear extermination. The apocalypse as sketched illustrates that the insanity of rampant progress and nuclear technology proceeds from the ancient and normal mechanism of territorial defense extended innocently and ignorantly into the dimension of time. But the territory of time isn't normal. It is a tricky and paradoxical environment for a biological creature. Normal animal mechanisms, of which territorial assertion is only one, loom as potential tragedies when instinctively applied within the supernatural dimension of time. The temporal dimension also dictates paradoxes and psychosexual motivations. We have already noted that future limitation is demanded by the dictates of temporal territorial assertion and defense. But, if we know that the future threatens us, why do we continue to reproduce? Surely, the temporally territorial creature would suffer psychosexual conflicts. Man, the only temporally territorial creature, is full of such conflicts. Even the most cursory biological glance at humanity reveals both the conflicts and the solutions that nature proposed to combat them. We find that those humans who are most committed to temporal communication, those who have the most powerful longing to exist simultaneously in past, present, and future, are unable to reproduce at all. Time is a non-biological environment. A biological creature presuming to inhabit it fully can do so only at the cost of genetic oblivion. Priests, nuns, exceptional thinkers, writers, and artists have all proved statistically sterile. It is not quite a functional and physical sterility. Celibacy is an intellectual decision. Even the average man is affected by psychosexual conflicts arising from the human possession of temporal territory. The average person experiences sexual approach avoidance. We suffer from sexual fears, uncertainties, and inadequacies apparently unknown in the animal world. We appreciate sexual stimulation, but we tend to shy away from reproduction. Nature has done its best to overcome our hesitation with an amazing number of stimulatory sexual adaptations. Nature tempts us to reproduce through the use of pleasure. Our stimulatory sexual adaptations are absolutely unique in terms of both quantity and quality. We naturally enjoy the stimulation, but we know the psychological implications of reproduction. Offspring are an identity threat. Our temporal identities are selfish. Therefore, we often voluntarily place ourselves in a position where we are exposed to sexual stimulation, but where intercourse is impossible. We watch striptease, we patronize pornography. If there is guilt, and there is, it comes from the impossibility of serving two masters at once. Once conceiving of time as territory, we cease to be completely natural. Our sexual adaptations and desires are an affront to the non-biological environment of the mind by which we communicate in time. Somehow, once glimpsing the vast spectacle of eternity, our sexual equipment and the act of reproduction seem shameful and irrelevant. The temporal territory, fully inhabited in all three tenses of past, present, and future, is nothing more than the spiritual world. At the same time, we are still very much a natural animal. We are also a biological species like any other. Those who turn away from the material world of day-to-day living also feel guilt. Extreme intellectualism is a cop-out from the natural world to which we also owe partial allegiance. The guilt of the cop-out often becomes insupportable. Suicides among exceptional thinkers, writers, artists, and poets are commonplace. Man is a biological creature attempting to inhabit an environment that is non-biological. This is the paradox of human existence. The concept of race. It is highly probable that different human races originated independently of one another and that they evolved out of different species of ape men. The so-called main races of mankind are not races, but species. The voice of blood and race operates down to the last refinement of thought and exercises a decisive influence on the direction of thought. Lothar Taralla, Rasse, Geist und Seele. The human species is a species because all its members have shared a more or less common biological history. Those of us who have paid some attention to the character and form of behavior of peoples belonging to different varieties have satisfied ourselves by every scientific means at our disposal that significantly or innately determined mental differences between the varieties of mankind have thus far not been determined. Ashley Montague, Man's Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race. The above two viewpoints illustrate the abundant truth of individuals exhibiting it. And since the human group possessing this higher level of aggression is sufficiently identifiable on the basis of skin color, the usual and erroneous criterion of race, I have made the decision to try to utilize racial prejudice in the interests of increased understanding of how Caucasoids have brought the contemporary world to the brink of several disasters. Professor Montague, in several books, has shown that modern racism stems from two separate fonts: a justification for slave economics, and inherent and erroneous assumptions in systems of classification when viewed in an evolutionary construct following the general acceptance of Darwin's thought. It is ironic that both religion and Darwinism were used to justify racism, since each system, for a while, vehemently opposed the other. Racism and slavery. When Europeans began seriously to expand in the middle of the 15th century, they immediately came into contact with people whom they could enslave. In Europe, as elsewhere at this time, slavery was an accepted, if limited, practice and had always been so. The practice was limited because of the scarcity of material. The medieval world acquired its slaves through either commerce or warfare. Generally, both commerce and warfare were conducted between neighboring peoples. By the time of European expansion, the world had stabilized to such a degree that neighboring peoples generally enjoyed a parity of sorts in the matter of technology. Therefore, because of the technological parity and a de facto sort of balance of power, slaves acquired in warfare did not represent a statistically large percentage of any European population. And because conflicts occurred between neighboring people, the slave population did not differ racially in any significant way from the master population. Before the European expansion of the 15th century, then, there had not been a racial basis to world slavery since ancient proto-historic and historic invasions, with one exception. It is ironic that the medieval world knew only one instance of racially based slavery, and that one instance occurred in Africa, imposed by black Africans upon an earlier population. As the Bantu peoples expanded toward the south in the African continent, they came into contact with Bushmen and Hottentot people who differed physically from the Bantu and who were promptly enslaved by them. While Montague would place all Africans under one of four major groups of mankind, C.S. Kuhn differentiates two races in Africa south of the Sahara: the Congoids, or Negroes, contemporary blacks, and Capoids, the Bushmen and Hottentots, who represent a distinct and more ancient stock. If Kuhn's distinction is accepted, then one race enslaved the other, and the Bantus came to equate a slave with the conquered race, and a racial justification and equation for slavery developed. What the blacks imposed upon the Capoids was soon to be imposed upon the blacks by white Europeans. Portuguese probing to the south along the African coast and Spanish exploration across the Atlantic brought Europeans into contact with less technologically advanced blacks and Amerindians. It was a dual meeting of differing physical types and technological levels, unique in the era of recorded history. The gulf between European technology and black and Amerindian technology presented an opportunity for exploitation which had not been equaled in Eurasia itself for centuries and perhaps millennia on a racial basis. It would seem reasonable that the last parallel of massive contact between men of different physical appearance and different technological level took place long before the dawn of recorded history, when Caucasoids invaded the Indian subcontinent, when the Mongoloids expanded southward into the Indo-Chinese subcontinent at the expense of the Australoid, and when, as already mentioned, the Bantu Congoids expanded southward in Africa at the expense of the Capoids. This story was uploaded to YouTube by Ink and Panels Manawanis for recaps. If you're enjoying this story, please support us by becoming a subscriber and remember to press the like button. With respect to the European expansion from the 15th century until the present, it was European technology which guaranteed the exploitation and defeat of blacks and Amerinds. In the beginning, at least, there did not seem to be any racial discrimination, at least in a pejorative sense, on the part of Europeans. Because of the friendly natives, Vasco da Gama could name a coastal district in Southeast Africa Terra de Boa Gente, land of the good people. Christopher Columbus could report that the Amerindians were of excellent and acute understanding and describe them as a loving, uncovetous people, so docile in all things that there is no better people or better country. They loved their neighbors as themselves, and they had the sweetest and gentlest way of speaking in the world, and always with a smile. Writing of the Hurons in 1640, Father Lejeune said, "I naturally compare our savages with certain villagers, because both are usually without education, though our villagers are more educated than these people." Cumbersome nature of external combustion. For tropical regions relying on vast plantations, no really viable alternative to sheer manpower became available until the development of the gasoline internal combustion engine and the modern tractor. Perhaps it is not too irreverent to suggest that the humane movement toward abolition, which gained momentum rapidly in industrial as opposed to agricultural areas, had an economic component which was at least as strong as the moral component. However this may be, when opposition to slavery and the slave trade began to be important, those who still depended upon slaves for their economic status, Southern agrarian planters, had to find some mechanism besides bald practicality to justify the bondage which was the foundation of their wealth. A race slavery connection had already been made due to the sheer numbers of blacks and Amerinds exploited. It now remained only to justify bondage by adding an inferiority argument which naturally explained subjugation of some men by others. Generations of slavery and lack of social and educational opportunities for black and Amerinds fulfillment had inevitably resulted in poor development of these people and their offspring in comparison with the whites. The cultural gulf between these blacks and Amerinds and whites was presented as evidence of natural biological and moral inferiority. Their inferiority and consequent slavery was a matter of natural law. Witness the following quotations from 19th century sources. "The red ant will issue in regular battle array to conquer and subjugate the black or Negro ant. These Negro slaves perform all the labor of the communities into which they are brought." Upon this definition, therefore, of the law of nature, Negro slavery would seem to be perfectly consistent with that law. In mental and moral development, slavery, so far from retarding, has advanced the Negro race. Contact with the Caucasian is the only civilizer of the Negro, and slavery the only condition on which that contact can be preserved. To prove that all men have equal right to liberty and all outward comforts of life is to invert the order that God hath set in the world, who hath ordained different degrees and orders of men, some to be high and honorable, some to be low and despicable, some to be monarchs, kings, princes and governors, masters and commanders, others to be subjects and to be commanded, servants of sundry sorts and degrees, bound to obey. Some to be born slaves, and so to remain during their lives, as hath been proved. The spurious reasoning of the slavery racial inferiority construct was complete. As Montague observes regarding the evolution of the construct from the mid-15th century to emancipation, their different physical appearance provided a convenient peg upon which to hang the argument that this represented the external sign of more profound, ineradicable mental and moral inferiorities. It was an easily grasped mode of reasoning, and in this way the obvious difference in their social status was equated with their obviously different physical appearance, which, in turn, was taken to indicate a fundamental biological difference. What had once been a social difference was now transformed into a biological difference which would serve, it was hoped, to justify and maintain the social difference. Perhaps more to the point, it was also hoped that these supposedly profound biological differences would justify an economic system. The attempt to perpetuate slavery was unsuccessful, as we all know. In the U.S., the Civil War ended slavery in 1865. Abolition in English colonies had been decreed by 1833, in French possessions by 1848, and in Dutch colonies by 1863. But while this slavery component of the slavery racial inferiority complex disappeared, the racial inferiority component lingers in continuing discrimination, continuing racism. Racism and Darwinism. Encyclopedists like Buffon, Linnaeus, and Blumenbach had used the term race merely as a convenience to catalog physically different kinds of men whom, however, they regarded as members of the same species. Darwinism, if not Darwin himself, bequeathed to the term race and to the catalogs of men a meaning which Buffon, Blumenbach, and Linnaeus never intended. If the Linnaean classification of animal and plant species indicated in many cases an evolutionary relationship between types, and this was undoubtedly so in the case of the human species, then it was easy to assume that different races of mankind represented different evolutionary stages and thus different degrees of perfection. Thus, some races were more evolved and others less evolved. If this was the case, then it was natural to assume that the more evolved races were superior in intelligence, morality, and in every other attribute of civilized man. Coincidentally, it turned out that the more evolved races were those of European stock who had the power to enforce their superiority on the less evolved races. Montague himself defines 4 major groups of mankind. He does not call them races, on the basis of skin color. From the standpoint of a classificatory view of mankind, which has due regard for the facts, it is arbitrarily possible to recognize 4 distinctive major groups of mankind. These are the Negroid or black, the archaic white or Australoid, the Caucasoid or white, and the Mongoloid major groups of mankind. Yet, skin color is only one way in which various human groups differ from each other. Groups also differ in the possession of other physical characters. This status quo, i.e. adaptive racial characteristics, entails not only the variations in bones and teeth that are evident in fossil men, and those of the surface features of living men, like skin, hair, lips, and ears, by which we can distinguish races almost at a glance, but also subtler differences seen only on the dissecting table or through the eyepieces of microscopes. Races differ in the extent and manner in which the fine subcutaneous muscles of the lips and cheeks have become differentiated from the parent mammalian muscle body, in the chemical composition of hair and bodily secretions, including milk, in the ways different muscles are attached to bones, in the sizes and probable secretion rates of different endocrines, in certain details of the nervous system, as, for example, how far down in the lumbar vertebrae the neural canal extends, and in the capacity of individuals to tolerate crowding and stress. There are good reasons for taking issue with the emphasis Professor Kuhn, an eminent anthropologist, gives this list of human variations, and we will question Kuhn's objectivity when we come to discuss his theory about the origin of races. For instance, it will become obvious that Kuhn appears to betray an emotional investment when he refers to a status quo in the genetic endowment of races. All humans are interfertile. All races can mix and produce fertile and viable offspring, and therefore no race possesses a genetic status quo. Races are not immutable entities. Also, in his list of human variation, Kuhn neglects to mention that most differences are a common legacy of all races to some degree, and that the racial distribution of most characteristics is a matter of degree, not undisputed ownership. Races may exhibit statistical differences in the presence or absence of a given variation, but seldom do human groups exhibit absolute presence or absence of a character. Even a dissecting table will not reveal the racial affinity of any one individual with any certainty. Lugro Clark, an Oxford anatomist, has said, "At first sight, the contrast in appearance of such extreme types as Negroid, Mongoloid, and European might suggest fundamental constitutional differences. In fact, however, a close anatomical study seems to show that the physical differences are confined to quite superficial characteristics. I may best emphasize this by saying that if the body of a Negro were to be deprived of all superficial features such as skin, hair, nose, and lips, I do not think that any anatomist could say for certain, in any isolated case, whether he was dealing with the body of a Negro or a European. Human beings do differ in their physical appearance, but the only reason for studying these differences and cataloging men on the basis of them is to determine whether such differences have some fundamental biological and evolutionary relevance. It is simply a fact that superficial characteristics like skin color, the color and form of hair, and the shape of noses, those characteristics which have been used often to differentiate races, not only have no apparent evolutionary significance, but are not even uniquely attributable to any one race. An analogy most understandable to the Western layman would be the situation of trying to compare car performance on the basis of paint job, presence or absence of hubcaps, the form of the hood ornament. There may indeed be real and significant difference in the comparative motivation of automobiles, but the place to look is under the hood, in the suspension and transmission. Road performance isn't relevant to the paint job and the chrome. Perhaps it is not stretching this analogy too far to observe that those who have been concerned with finding the comparative worth of races in terms of road performance along the path of evolution have pinned their hopes on superficial characteristics that would not influence an experienced car buyer. There are human differences in skin color, nose shape, hair form, etc., but these differences are not concordant. A certain nose shape isn't always correlated with a certain skin color. A certain type of hair isn't always correlated with either skin color or nose shape. Cranial capacity, the size of the brain, doesn't vary concordantly with skin color. Variation is an endangered species, but not quite extinct. In 1962, Carlton Kuhn, of the University of Pennsylvania, published a work entitled The Origin of Races, and the waves have not yet subsided. Kuhn's views brought thundering replies from Montague, S.L. Washburn, and almost every other modern anthropologist. It seemed that Kuhn's construct two nearly paralleled racist doctrines, like that propounded by Tyre. Not only have facts been disputed, but his motivations have been suspected. I must confess that I suspect Kuhn's motivations. In The Origin of Races, Kuhn purported to be able to distinguish 5 major races of mankind and to trace their evolution from somewhat differing hominid ancestors. Kuhn considers that the species we call Homo sapiens is more nearly a state, not so much a species, and that the 5 races crossed this sapiens threshold at different times and essentially separately, but with some genetic help from neighbors. Kuhn says, at the beginning of our record, over 500,000 years ago, man was a single species, Homo erectus, perhaps already divided into 5 geographic races or subspecies. Homo erectus then evolved into Homo sapiens not once, but 5 times, as each subspecies, living in its own territory, passed a critical threshold from a more brutal to a more sapient state. As if this were not enough, Kuhn goes on to state, each major race had followed a pathway of its own through the labyrinth of time. Each had been molded in a different fashion to meet the needs of different environments, and each had reached its own level on the evolutionary scale. At best, and being charitable, it must be said that Kuhn indulges in the use of terms which are scientifically incautious and emotionally charged, and does so with dubious justification. Montague, in criticizing Kuhn, observes that it is something of a non sequitur to say that man has passed from a more brutal to a more sapient state, since modern man is manifestly more brutal than even the bad-tempered cynocephalia and, one suspects, enormously more brutal in his behavior than primitive man. At worst, and not being so charitable, one can point to passages in Kuhn's work which reflect the author's apparent belief in the superiority of some races, and each has reached its own level on the evolutionary scale, is one example of such a statement, while the following statement is another. It is a fair inference that fossil men now extinct were less gifted than their descendants who have larger brains, that the subspecies that crossed the evolutionary threshold into the category of Homo sapiens the earliest have evolved the most, and the obvious correlation between the length of time a subspecies has been in the sapiens state and the levels of civilization attained by some of its members may be related phenomena. Kuhn's 5 races are the Caucasoid, the Mongoloid, the Australoid, the Congoid, and the Capoid. Of these, the Caucasoid and the Mongoloid races passed over this sapiens threshold the earliest and are the most evolved, The Australoids are closest to this threshold, and Kuhn rather obviously refrains from stating his belief that some Australoids are straddling it, while Kuhn's Congoids are something of a recent and mysterious development which can't be explained. Kuhn says, the origin of the African Negroes and of the Pygmies is the greatest unsolved mystery in the field of racial study. I disagree with Kuhn in that I feel that the white man's peculiar obsession with racial study is the greatest unsolved mystery in the field of racial study. Kuhn's Congoids, then, are a mystery, but Kuhn is certain that they're a recent and therefore less evolved development. As far as we know now, the Congoid line started on the same evolutionary level as the Eurasiatic ones in the early Middle Pleistocene, and then stood still for 500,000 years, after which Negroes and Pygmies appeared as if out of nowhere. And elsewhere Kuhn remarks, if Africa was the cradle of mankind, it was only an indifferent kindergarten. Europe and Asia were our principal schools. My judgment of Kuhn's thesis is that he gives reasonable support for the existence of an Australoid Pithecanthropus line, for a Mongoloid Sinanthropus line, and not much else. I believe that he can be accused of special pleading when he constructs an argument for an early sapient state among Caucasoids on the basis of one skull, Steinheim, and 3 cranial fragments, Swanscombe. More so when he admits that he did not examine the skull itself, but only a cast. Since the Steinheim skull is incomplete, and the Swanscombe fragments consist of an occipital and 2 parietals found at 3 separate times in Thames River gravels, the evidence is extremely tenuous. They can all breed together if the opportunity or necessity arises. In practice, although the different kinds or races of Canada geese can interbreed, they do not generally do so to an excessive degree. Each group represents a gene pool exhibiting one or more characteristics which distinguish it from other kinds of Canada geese. It is the varieties within species that are tested by selection. If one set of racial characteristics proves especially survival-prone, the interfertility of the species makes it possible for that set of characteristics to be transmitted and enjoyed by the remainder of the species through interbreeding. A species does not evolve as a unit. Rather, a species in process of evolution may be regarded as something of an amoeba exploring its surroundings. The species, like the amoeba, puts out feelers. Races, geographic races, subspecies, varieties, kinds, whatever you want to call them, and if one or more explorations prove particularly successful, the remainder of organisms, under the pressure of selection, gradually shift in the new direction. It seems reasonable that this is evolution, the testing of variety on the subspecific level, not on the specific level. It is difficult to imagine any other process which could account for sufficient genetic flexibility and sufficient genetic stability to result in new species evolving, which is to say having a relationship with an ancestral one. It does not seem unreasonable to suppose that the human species, like animal ones, might evolve through the expression of its races. In fact, this appears to have happened. While saying that genetics shows us that typology must be completely removed from our thinking if we are to progress, in the process of criticizing thinking, S.L. Washburn gives evidence to the contrary. He says, if we are concerned with history, let us consider, on the one hand, the ancestors of these Bushmen 15,000 years ago and the area available to them, to their way of life, and, on the other hand, the ancestors of the Europeans at the same time in the area available to them, with their way of life. We will find that the area available to the Bushmen was at least twice that available to the Europeans. The Bushmen were living in a land of optimum game. The Europeans were living close to an ice sheet. There were perhaps from 3 to 5 times as many Bushman ancestors as there were European ancestors only 15,000 years ago. If one were to name a major race, or a primary race, the Bushmen have a far better claim in terms of the archaeological record than the Europeans. Yet, as we observed earlier, the Bushmen were killed off by Bantu advancing southward and by whites advancing northward in Africa. The Bushman, as a type or kind of man, is on the road to extinction. Because of changing conditions and interspecific competition, the Bushman's type has yielded its primacy in Africa to the Congoids, or blacks. There are some whites in Africa south of the Sahara, and they are witnessing a reduction in their primacy in competition with the blacks. This loss of primacy is a euphemism for conflict and extermination. We may judge such conflicts to be social and cultural ones, and they are, but they also have a direct bearing upon the composition of the gene pool in a geographic area. If Washburn's construct is correct, then, during the last 15,000 years, Africa has witnessed a reduction in Bushman typology and an increase in Congoid typology. In Africa, the human species has evolved away from the Bushman stock and toward the Congoid stock. The human species as a whole has therefore shifted toward the Congoid expression in terms of its genetic potential. Similarly, Kuhn presented evidence which indicated a previous Australoid habitation of much of the Indo-Chinese peninsula. Mongoloids inhabit the area now. The area has evolved toward the Mongoloid expression and away from the Australoid expression, and the entire human genetic potential has shifted accordingly. Therefore, according to Washburn's own argument, a major human type 15,000 years ago, a primary race, that of the Bushmen, has been almost entirely replaced by another human type, the Congoid. It is difficult to see, therefore, how Washburn can maintain that genetics shows us that typology must be completely removed from our thinking if we are to progress. It seems that evolution is the testing of types on a subspecific level. In the last 15,000 years, as Washburn would have it, 2 of Kuhn's 5 major races have been drastically reduced in number and in terms of influencing the human species genetically, while the other 3 major races have expanded from their original respective bailiwicks. Compared to the situation 15,000 years ago, the human species has altered its genetic composition through the agency of change on the subspecific level. Rather than try to explain the relative extermination or selecting out of Bushman and Australoid genes on the basis of mere chance or geographical factors, I think it is more sensible to recognize that at certain times and places, under specific environmental conditions, some human kinds may be better fitted to survive than others. Australian tribes hauntingly refer to their dim past as dreamtime, and the richness of their memory argues for a fuller cultural life in that lost epoch than they enjoyed at the coming of Cook. Then, the Australoids must have reached Australia somehow, and yet, when discovered by the Europeans, no Australian tribe possessed watercraft capable of crossing the Wallace Line. Their life, like that of the Bushmen, had dwindled. Before leaving this subject, because I do not want to be accused of patronizing and apologizing for people whom anthropologists have almost universally labeled primitive races, something should be said about the artistic life of Capoids and Australoids before they were exterminated or immediately after they reached their havens. They have been characterized as a generally artless people in comparison with other races of mankind, and they were when first discovered by whites. But it seems that they had not always been so. Bushman paintings have recently been discovered in Rhodesia and South Africa, and they rival the cave art of France in both naturalistic and abstract expression. Surviving Bushmen know very well that their ancestors once painted, but, as some of them told Lorenz van der Post, they now lack the spirit to do so. Similarly, there are cliff drawings in Australia which must have been executed by the ancestors of present-day Aborigines, yet the tribesmen themselves have forgotten. Places where such figures occur are merely holy, in some poignant fashion relating to the forever lost dreamtime. It may be worth mentioning here that with the Capoids, human potential may have taken a somewhat unique direction, a direction which would be precious today and whose loss is bitter. Van der Post was told by several different Kalahari tribesmen that the Bushmen could speak the baboons' language until about a century ago, but no longer, and that they used to be able to communicate with many other animals and plants. Van der Post saw no reason to doubt this assertion, and neither do I, especially considering recent experiments with such diverse creatures as dolphins and philodendrons, which indicate sentience of some sort. All peoples have preserved legends about a time of human-animal communication, but the Capoid traditions seem both more recent and more vital. The white man's way of doing things, as illustrated by our cumbersome experiments with dolphins' communication and shock at discovering philodendron sentience, appears to be significantly inferior when compared to Capoid abilities. But returning to the original point being made, whether one attributes Capoid-Australoid extermination mainly to geographical factors, as I do, or finds it convenient to chalk their extermination up to their inferiority as expressions of mankind, these two races offer an example of how the human species has altered its genetic potential by subspecific activity. Like Canada geese, the human species evolves by activity of its component parts. The species doesn't evolve as a unit, as Ashley Montagu would have it, but through the medium of its races. If that is so, the concreteness of the term may be questioned to some degree, and we are left with the idea that a species is an assemblage of individuals or groups of individuals, sharing genetic characters and varying, but sufficiently alike to be interfertile. Under this construct of species dynamics, C.S. Kuhn's theory loses much of its titillating controversy for supporters and opponents alike. Why shouldn't a species, Homo erectus, have consisted of 5 or more subspecies or races representing slightly differing genetic expressions and being mutually interfertile? And what is so odd about the possibility that these advanced primates, all of whom were on the verge of human emergence, would have taken the same general path toward man? Kuhn says that these races of the erectus species independently crossed the sapiens threshold and merged into the species called Homo sapiens. Montagu holds that 5 independent crossings into the sapiens domain is expecting too much from convergence. Because we constructed this edifice in our own psychobiological image, we naturally considered it both good and superior. Once coming into significant contact with men of other races, we searched about for some mechanism to explain our goodness and superiority. Quite naturally, we assumed that we must have superior amounts of some good characteristic. We banked on a superior intelligence, but the concept is bankrupt. It has only been since the end of World War II that Western man has come to doubt, seriously and sincerely, his values and his works, and only because both have evolved to the point where they threaten his own survival. We are suffering from resource shortages, pollution, nuclear, racist and sexist traumas and nightmares. They are specters of our own Caucasoid psychobiology. That cannot be denied, even to ourselves, because just before these aspects of the contemporary world passed some threshold of critical mass and became threats, we proudly took credit for the attitudes and technology which spawned them. Precisely because we are threatened by our own works and values, and are slowly beginning to remove our rose-colored spectacles in the interest of survival and clear vision, we may now be ready to accept the fact that we Caucasoids are neither good nor superior. In fact, perhaps we have reached the point where we might be able to reach agreement among ourselves that we may possess superior amounts of a bad characteristic compared to all other men. This book is racist because I believe that history shows that men can be divided into 2 divisions on the basis of one significant characteristic. There are Caucasoids and everybody else. The significant characteristic shared unequally by these 2 groups is aggression. Our works and our values reflect aggression. Our technology is aggression directed against the natural world. Our unexcelled military technology is aggression directed against our fellow human beings. Much of our art and our culture reflects sexual aggression. We were always right. We are different, just as we always suspected. Only now, the results of this difference don't seem so good, intelligent, or superior. Our conceit is bankrupt, or at least seriously overdrawn, and maybe we're ready to do some objective racial accounting. The significant difference between ourselves and other men, our racially higher level of aggression, must be explained if we are to deal with it. We differ from other men in one other respect. Of all major groups, only Caucasoids cross the sapiens threshold in a glacial environment. It is my contention that the rigors of this rite of passage traumatized us. No matter how patently obvious, I will try to offer some defensible construct to account for our abnormally high level of aggression. And in proffering this explanation, I would like to try to generate as much goodwill as possible in advance by freely admitting that it is going to be tenuous, barely defensible, and maybe not much more satisfying than no explanation at all. But, after saying this, I will also maintain that it will be much more defensible than theories about our moral superiority and or higher intelligence resulting from earlier evolution into the sapient state. The explanation will be somewhat thin simply because our knowledge about prehistoric man is threadbare. Worse, especially in the West, the fabric of human evolution is adorned with confusing and sometimes conflicting patterns. The mind is easily led astray, and I can only hope that the thread I followed has any real continuity. Anyone who thinks I've picked on the wrong thread, or lost it somewhere in the warp and woof of skeletal and cultural material, is free to choose another which, perhaps, holds more promise of unraveling the secret of obvious Caucasoid behavioral differences. I will begin by dismissing Kuhn's evidence for a very early Caucasoid emergence into the sapient estate. Kuhn does not commit himself about the species of the Heidelberg jaw for 150,000 BP, but says only, as a single bone, the Maurer mandible, i.e. Heidelberg jaw, belongs to the expected grade, considering its antiquity, but because there is no Maurer cranium, we do not know to which species, Homo erectus or Homo sapiens, Heidelberg man belonged. Maurer therefore stands on a baseline of its own. Elsewhere, Kuhn does not hesitate to damn a cranium-less jaw to the category of Homo erectus, and there are few anthropologists who would hesitate very long about putting Heidelberg in that category. For reasons outlined earlier, I consider the Steinheim cranium and the Swanscombe fragments much too dubious to be of any assistance whatsoever in ascertaining when the sapiens threshold was crossed in Europe. These bones date from the Great, Second, Mindel-Riss interglacial about 325,000 years ago. To some degree, the Steinheim-Swanscombe material is apparently related to the Fontechevade crania, which are some 100,000 years younger. H. V. Valois says of the Fontechevade skull material, the essential fact is the absolute absence of a supraorbital torus. The glabella and the brow ridges are less developed than in the Upper Paleolithic Europeans, or even in the majority of Europeans living today. According to Kuhn, Fontechevade II, the more nearly complete skull, resembles Swanscombe closely. But we must recall that Swanscombe man, actually the bones are believed to have belonged to a woman, consists of 3 separate fragments discovered at 3 separate times in river gravel. Swanscombe was not recovered from a stratified site. There is no proof that the fragments belong together since they were not found at the same time. And even if they belong together, the disjointed skull may have been intruded into faunal association, which dates it. It would seem that a hypothetical evolutionary line based on Fontechevade Swanscombe is a very tenuous support for immensely ancient sapience in Europe. Perhaps the most that can safely be said is that the Fontechevade people seem to have crossed the sapient threshold about 225,000 years ago, as far as morphology is concerned, bearing in mind the fact that physical characteristics are only the roughest indication of the possession of cultural sentience. The age of Fontechevade is not in too much disagreement with W. W. Howell's opinion that Homo sapiens appeared in Europe, almost certainly, some 150,000 years ago. The age of Fontechevade, and its very ephemeral relationship with Swanscombe, may be in at least inferential accord with Le Gros-Clark's grudging acceptance that Swanscombe might be considered as a very primitive expression of Homo sapiens. If sapiens may have appeared at Swanscombe, it should have almost certainly appeared in Fontechevade. A note of caution is sounded by S. L. Washburn's opinion that the species Homo sapiens appeared perhaps as recently as 50,000 years ago. Washburn's doubt seems to stem from an uncertainty about the place of the Neanderthals in the scheme of things. This is a problem to which we will turn presently, but not quite yet. While feeling compelled to record other experts' disagreement with his theory of a 300,000 or 400,000-year-old antiquity of sapience in Europe, Kuhn does so with a trace of petulance. As no one in the Anglo-American world knows more about Steinheim and Swanscombe than these 4 experts, i.e., Le Gros-Clark, W. W. Howells, Clark Howell, and S. L. Washburn, who are well aware of the date of these skulls, the reader may choose between their verdicts and my tentative conclusions. Joachim Niender's reputation as a minor literary figure was honored in the name of a small river valley near Dusseldorf, the Neanderthal. In this small valley, in 1856, a human skullcap was discovered. A similar cranium had been found in Forbes's quarry on the Rock of Gibraltar in 1848, but the importance of this skull wasn't recognized until 1864. Following the publication of Darwin's The Origin of Species in 1859, these 2 pieces, figuratively swept under the table, suddenly became significant for a serious study of human evolution by means of the fossil record. Dr. H. Schaffhausen examined the skull found in the Niender Valley and pronounced it to be a relic of one of the barbarous tribes that inhabited Europe before the Celts and Germans, or perhaps a relic of one of those wild races of northwestern Europe described by Tacitus. Schaffhausen seems to be responsible for coining the term Neanderthal man, with the implied meaning of a type or race of man, to the sorrow and confusion of more than a century of anthropology. But it is worth noting that the most famous pathologist of the time, the great Rudolf Virchow, disagreed with Schaffhausen. Firko doubted that Neanderthal man was the representative of a separate type or race of human being. For Firko, the brutal skull was evidence of an individual human pathology. The skull was the remains of a human freak, the unfortunate victim of acromegaly. During the early 1860s, someone noticed that the Gibraltar skull was very similar to the Neanderthal cranium. The similarity of the two skulls, their wide geographical separation, and the monkey wind generated by Darwin's theory of evolution, all combined to force the consensus that these skulls were representative of a type of man that had existed before modern man and was now extinct. The theory of evolution more or less required a missing link, some very primitive type of creature somewhere between ape and man, and the Neanderthal skull seemingly supplied him very quickly following the origin of species. Neanderthal's massive brow ridges, his low, broad cranial vault, and his prognathous jaw distinguished him from modern man, were more ape-like, and suited the theory of evolution. For a long time, almost 30 years, Neanderthal was the most primitive fossil man known, and in the absence of competing missing links his brutality was emphasized. As Dr. Harry L. Shapiro says, thus, the primitiveness of Neanderthal man was overstressed, because for a long time he was our only ancestral form. Although his differences from modern man were visible and real enough, they were exaggerated in a way that might not have been the case if we had found the earliest types of man first and worked our way up to the Neanderthal type. But it was not until 1891 to 92 that the much more primitive Pithecanthropus erectus was found in Java by Dr. Eugene Du Bois, and not until 1911 that the Piltdown skull, hoax aside, was found by Charles Dawson in Sussex. The major discoveries which have given anthropologists some perspective on human evolution did not come until the decade 1925 to 1935, and included Australopithecus, 1924, Sinanthropus, 1926, Swanscombe man in 1935, and Steinheim man shortly afterwards. Von Koenigswald's discovery of additional Pithecanthropine material, including an even more primitive Meganthropus, did not come until the later 30s. Description and analysis of these finds lagged far behind their initial discovery, of course, and study was impeded by the war. The upshot was that a satisfactory consensus on the general outlines of human evolution was not achieved until the 1950s and 1960s by scientists themselves, and this working model has still not percolated down to the layman. Neanderthal's brutal characteristics and his isolation as a fossil human type for so many years allowed an erroneous impression of human evolution in general, and Neanderthal's place in it specifically, to become thoroughly entrenched in the popular mind. But, while saying this, it must be admitted that the contemporary consensus achieved by the anthropologists about the general outline of human evolution still leaves Neanderthals somewhat up in the air. This is particularly unfortunate for us since the Neanderthals very recently occupied the part of the world which is the cradle of the Caucasoid race, and the most extreme Neanderthals occupied the part of Europe which has produced the most extreme manifestations of Caucasoid aggression, see Figure 2. Since this is true, and since it did not happen so very long ago in terms of human evolution, it is very tempting to assume that Neanderthal traits must have had something to do with Caucasoid aggression in general and its apparent concentration in Western Europe. And this is the direction we will pursue, while fully recognizing that dictum which warns that correlation isn't necessarily causation. It is only fair to point out that there is no scientific consensus regarding the Neanderthal-Caucasoid connection. Populations of Krapina and Fontechevade. In Europe, then, there was a 60,000-year regression of man's physical evolution, but this regression mysteriously coincides with a significant advance in cultural development. In the light of our present knowledge, this cannot be satisfactorily explained. It must simply be accepted for the moment. Scientists are divided in their opinions about the origins of the Neanderthals. There is evidence that the Neanderthals moved into Eurasia from elsewhere as the advancing Wormian glaciers drove more modern men out. But there is also some evidence that at least some Neanderthal traits developed in Europe itself, particularly in Italy. Like everything else about the Neanderthals, their origin is in dispute. Sacapastor. In 1929, Sergio Sergi found the skull of a 30-year-old woman in the gravel pit of Sacapastor just outside the walls of Rome. 7 years later, Baron A.C. Blanc and the famous Abbé Brule found a second skull, a male's, in the same location. These skulls are the first to indicate the appearance of Neanderthal morphological characteristics in Europe, even though they are not classically Neanderthal. A comparison of the Sacapastor skulls with those from Krapina reveals the one trait which immediately distinguishes Neanderthal cranial form from that of modern man. In the Krapina crania and in modern ones, the brain case approximates the shape of a sphere or ball atop the spinal column, whereas the Sacapastor brain cases, and later fully Neanderthal ones, are more like a cylinder balanced horizontally on the spinal column. Kuhn describes the Sacapastor brain cases as barrels laying on their side. The cranial capacities of the Sacapastor skulls are not impressive compared to roughly contemporaneous, round-headed skulls. Sacapastor 1, the better-preserved female cranium found in 1929, has a calculated volume of about 1,200 cubic centimeters, while the more fragmentary male skull in 1936 is perhaps 100 cubic centimeters larger. By comparison, Fontechevade and Krapina crania have a capacity of about 1,450 cubic centimeters. In both size and shape, the Sacapastor skulls recall Eastern H. erectus crania, and there is one other point of similarity. Sacapastor 1 has no less than 16 Wormian bones, a world record. Wormian bones are extra bones, separated by sutures, in the area of the junction of the parietals and the occipital bones. These extra bones are found in modern Mongoloid skulls, ancient Andean ones, and in the Sinanthropus series. They are also characteristic of Neanderthal crania, of which Sacapastor may be a racial ancestor. See Figure 3. The idea that the Neanderthals were particularly cold-adapted just isn't supported by any fact. Second, Bushnell and McBurney may be in error in holding that the Chinese flints at Tingsun are typologically Mysterian. Third, by about 100,000 BP, it is possible that the Sinanthropus line had already crossed the sapiens threshold and needed no help from hypothetically sapiens European Caucasoids. However, the Kuhn hypothesis is an explanation for Neanderthal origins, however tenuous, and in fairness it must be said that Kuhn exhibits no great investment in it, but merely offers it as a suggestion. There is another theory of Neanderthal origins which rests upon cultural and skeletal discoveries of Baron A.C. Blanc, who traced the Mysterian tool-making culture back to the Riss glacial period in Italy, or, in other words, back to about 200,000 years BP. Mysterian is associated with, and very nearly inseparable from, the Neanderthal genotype. Thus, if Blanc's evidence is to be accepted, the Mysterian beginnings in Italy are of great antiquity and complement the discovery of the Proto-Neanderthal skulls in the Sacapastor quarry outside of Rome. Neanderthal man and his cultural assemblage may therefore be indigenous to Europe and of an antiquity comparable to the supposed sapiens' morphological emergence. On the basis of Blanc's evidence, it is at least possible that the Neanderthals' resemblance to Eastern man with respect to skull form, Wormian bones and teeth is purely superficial and shows no evolutionary relationship. Blanc's research indicates that there may have been two separate strains of man in Europe, sapiens and Neanderthal, as early as 200,000 years ago. So, in conclusion, we may summarize by saying that the Neanderthals originated in one of the following ways. By mixture of European Caucasoid stock with Eastern Sinanthropus mongoloid stock, by indigenous evolution in Europe itself from sapiens stock, or from some more ancient stock, due to selection for cold survival qualities. Whatever their origin, it is enough to know that the Neanderthals represent a fairly distinct type of human, fairly obviously cold-adapted since they flourished during a glacial epoch. They dominated Europe from 100,000 to about 40,000 years ago and occupied what later became the Caucasoid racial domain. Further, we may add that the most extreme Neanderthals inhabited the part of Europe which later manifested extreme Caucasoid aggression, reflected in incessant warfare and eventual cultural and geographic expansion at the expense of other races. Neanderthal characteristics. However elusive Neanderthal origins may be, both the physical characteristics and the geographical distribution of the genotype are well known. As of 1962, Carlton Kuhn could say, there are some 82 true Neanderthals found in 42 sites. Their geographical distribution follows a distinct pattern. For the most part, they favored the portions of Western and Southern Europe now lying south of the present-day January frost line. And elsewhere, their time span is early Worm or Worm I, from about 75,000 years ago to the beginning of the Gottweg interstadial, about 40,000 years ago. Its Lebensraum was Europe, Western Asia, and Central Asia as far as the Altai Mountains and south to the Hindu Kush. Its culture was Mysterian, itself a complex of earlier tool-making techniques. By 1971, the amount of Neanderthal material had increased dramatically. Ralph Seletsky writes, "We are not exactly sure at this writing how many Neanderthal skeletons or individuals have been found in the world, nor how many archaeological sites are involved. However, using some recent counts and some scattered references, there are at least 44 sites with 86 Neanderthals in Europe, 12 sites and 45 individuals in the Near East, and 12 sites and 24 individuals elsewhere. For the first time in our dealings with fossil men, there is abundant skeletal material, though some bones are not well represented, and even some significant cultural remains. Our physical and cultural pen portrait of the Neanderthals as a group cannot be far off, at least nowhere near as problematical as our vision of other fossil hominid populations. There is one problem in assessing this material, however, and it generally is in mind when sweeping generalities about Neanderthals are made. Yet, La Chapelle is not an atypical Neanderthal. He is a very extreme individual variation on the basic Neanderthal scheme of things. La Chapelle boasts the most beetling brows and the most chinless jaw of any Neanderthal specimen. The use of La Chapelle as the Neanderthal type by several generations of writers has rather naturally tended to emphasize the real physical differences which do exist between the Neanderthals and ourselves. The choice of La Chapelle as the type specimen was somewhat unfortunate because of his rather extreme individual characteristics, but even more unfortunate because La Chapelle's departures from the basic Neanderthal plan are aggravated by senile degeneration and arthritis, and because, according to Kuhn, his skeleton was faultily mounted in the first place. Therefore, unlike many writers, we will not rely on the Neanderthal type specimen in our discussion of the genotype's characteristics, but mentally create an average Neanderthal, as it were, from an amalgam of many slightly varying individuals. When this is done, our view of the Neanderthals will require some revision. As Kuhn says, in the last century the fame of Neanderthal man has increased. He is pictured as a crouching, stooping, squat, and brutal creature, with huge jaws and little or no forehead, and a low grade of intelligence. Flesh reconstructions of his face make him look like an ape. In this guise he has become the prototype of innumerable cartoons, in which a slant-browed man, clad in a skin, hits a woman over the head and drags her unconscious body into a cave. This, the popular image of Neanderthal man, will probably be with us for decades to come, because it is picturesque, exciting, and flattering to ourselves. But it is wrong, and so are most of the elements in the total Neanderthal concept. If anything, the erroneous image of Neanderthal brutality became even more vivid after the discovery of Cro-Magnon man. For some years we somewhat shamefully accepted Neanderthal as our ancestor. Then the Upper Paleolithic Europeans were discovered in quantity, including Cro-Magnon man, and our joy was unbounded at the discovery of Cro-Magnon's art and chin. Cro-Magnon, then, was quickly adopted as the true ancestor of modern man, and the more primitive Neanderthals suffered by comparison. Cro-Magnon was eulogized, just as Neanderthal was despised, and both emphases are myths. Cro-Magnon has been presented as a physically giant and perfect specimen of humanity, one to which modern man might even suffer by comparison. Yet, the average stature of 12 Cro-Magnon skeletons is just 5 feet 8 inches, 173 centimeters, shorter than modern Americans, whose average height is now over 5 feet 10 inches. During the height of the Cro-Magnon adoption, from about 1900 to 1920, H.G. Wells could write in his outline of history that Cro-Magnon man would have disdained interbreeding with Neanderthals because the odor of the Neanderthals would doubtless have been offensive to Cro-Magnon's evolved sensitivities. Needless to say, a modern man would probably find the stench of the Neanderthal cave and a Cro-Magnon one equally offensive. Compared to the individual variation present in collections of most fossil hominid groups, the skulls and postcranial bones of Neanderthals are remarkably similar. Kuhn observes that some very strong selective agency must have rapidly pruned off individuals who deviated excessively from the basic Neanderthal blueprint, And this is especially true of the Neanderthals of Western Europe, where the cold of the worm glaciation was at its height. Somewhat more deviance was apparently permitted in areas of more moderate climate further removed from the ice sheet. Neanderthals of the Zagros, the Levant, and of Central Eurasia were less extreme than the Neanderthals of Western Europe, who lived in the heart of worm. But, in spite of some west-to-east decrease in brutality, the Neanderthals were an exceptionally cohesive genotype in terms of both morphology and culture. Neanderthals had low, broad skulls which curved outward over the ears and which overhung the area of muscle attachment at the back of the neck. Neanderthal foreheads sloped sharply backwards from large brow ridges, and the skulls have definite depressions at both major sutures. But even though they are low and broad, Neanderthal crania are round in section and not pentagonal in section as in Homo erectus. Neanderthal skulls were very large compared to the size of skulls in modern man, being an average of 30 millimeters longer and 20 millimeters wider. See Figure 6. The cranial capacities of Neanderthal skulls range from 1,525 to 1,640 cubic centimeters in 6 male skulls and from 1,300 to 1,425 cubic centimeters in 3 female skulls. This is from 100 to 250 cubic centimeters, larger than the average cranial capacities of modern Caucasoids, but the sexual differentiation with respect to cranial capacity was much greater among Neanderthals than among more modern populations. The Neanderthal-type specimen, La Chapelle, the most neatly chinless of Neanderthal mandibles, as these profiles show. Other Neanderthals boasted at least a hint of chin. Note the gap between the last molar and the upward rising part of the jaw bones, coracoid process of ascending ramus. This gap is characteristic of Neanderthals and shows how their jaws had been stretched forward to match extreme nasal development. After Kuhn. Reprinted with permission of Alfred A. Knopf Incorporated. Modern jaws. The remarkably developed nasal profiles exhibited by Shanidar I and Skull 4, the characteristic stretching of the mandible, and the number and size of mental foramina were all components of one adaptive package. Neanderthals were cold-adapted, as their time and habitat would suggest. Kuhn advanced the idea that the Neanderthal nose was a special cold weather adaptation, a massive radiator, to warm incoming air and remove incoming cold air as far from the brain as possible. Neanderthal sinuses are also remarkably well developed for the same reason. Kuhn therefore disagrees with the generalized image of Neanderthals as reflected in classic flesh reproductions, which emphasize the prognathous jaws. Kuhn's reconstructions emphasize the nasal development of which the stretched mandibles are only a secondary and concomitant feature. On a bone-by-bone basis, the postcranial skeletons of the Neanderthals compare in size and shape with modern man. Some of the bones are stout, but none are so massive that they cannot be matched among living people. The feet and hands were broader than is usual among living people, but fully human. Kuhn says that no evidence yet produced indicates that Neanderthal hands were notably different from those of hard-working modern Europeans. Of the feet, he says, they looked like Russian rather than English feet. I think it can be fairly said that Kuhn is seeking to minimize certain differences between ourselves and the Neanderthals. Neanderthal hands and feet can be matched among living people, but not easily. The Neanderthal footprints found in the moist clay floor of the Witch's Cave, near Torriano, Italy in 1948 show a very broad short foot. The plantar index of these prints is around 1.61, which, translated into modern commercial shoe sizes, is an EE and isn't manufactured. The curvature of Neanderthal ribs testifies to very deep chests and a couple of preserved sternums, extremely concave on the inner surface, emphasize this. Some Neanderthal ribs are either round or triangular in section, a departure from the modern European ribbon-like form. In addition to being deep, the lower part of Neanderthal rib cages appears to have been unusually large, almost flared, as shown in Skull 5 and Skull 4. The Neanderthal pelvis was within the modern size range for Europeans, but the ilium had a tendency to flare upward and outward above the sacrum. Kuhn calls this condition supernegroid. But since Negroids are a tropical people and Neanderthals were cold-adapted, the flaring pelvis must have served a different function, probably related to supporting a very broad trunk. The Origin of Races was a massive and detailed work in which Carlton Kuhn set out to identify, isolate, and trace the evolution of 5 primal human groups, subspecies, or races, as each progressed towards modern man and the sapiens threshold. In spite of the furious and emotional objections of liberal anthropologists like Ashley Montague, Kuhn seems to have been largely successful with at least 2 of his 5 primal groups. Relying on the work of Weidenreich, Kuhn reiterated Weidenreich's argument that, in the Far East, man was mongoloid before he could be called sapiens, that race was older than species. And if Montague, Washburn, Hogben, Hiernox, and many others reject this contention as an affront to humanity, there are others of equal stature who find Kuhn's and Weidenreich's evidence objectively compelling. Harold L. Shapiro says that the living Chinese tend to regard Sinanthropus as at least one of their ancestors would be strongly justified by these, Weidenreich's comparisons. That Peking man looked like a primitive version of the present-day Chinese would seem to be equally borne out by the available data. Kuhn and Weidenreich seem to have presented a defensible argument for a Sinanthropus mongoloid racial line. I think that any fair-minded reader would admit that Kuhn presents an only slightly less defensible argument for the existence of a distinct Pithecanthropus australoid racial line. It may be accurate, or at least defensible, to refer to these lines as races in the manner in which people seem to use that ill-defined term, a strain or kind which had a distinct origin and which has remained relatively isolated and identifiable. But the term race cannot be used in this sense for Kuhn's other 3 groups, and especially it cannot be used in this sense for Caucasoids. With respect to Kuhn's hypothetical Congoid and Capoid racial lines, there are simply not enough data to support his contentions. But with Kuhn's Caucasoids, the situation is much worse. If the term race is to mean anything, it must be used in the context of some cohesive genetic origin and continuity. It is perhaps permissible, therefore, to refer to the Mongoloid and Australoid races in this context. But if there is anything which is characteristic of human evolution in the West, it is a lack of cohesion and continuity. The Neanderthal genotype apparently intruded upon the evolutionary pattern of an indigenous European genotype. It is commonly said that the Neanderthals died out, or became extinct. But what does this mean? It used to mean that most anthropologists believe that the Neanderthal disappeared from the Eurasian scene, without contributing to the modern Europoid gene pool. But this view is losing ground. Kuhn, Seletsky, Shapiro, and an increasing number of anthropologists now tend to think that the Neanderthals were absorbed by people migrating into Eurasia or returning. If the modern Eurasian population is an amalgam of Neanderthal genes and genes possessed by the returning, primal Eurasian population, then the term race cannot be applied to Caucasoids in the same way that it can be applied to Mongoloids or Australoids. For Caucasoids, race cannot mean a genetic continuity. At most, the term race can only refer to a state. The Caucasoids are merely the result of a complicated genetic amalgam, not the result of genetic continuity. The word race cannot be applied to both situations with any justification or honesty. Yet, the word race seems to have a magnetic hold on Kuhn, and he applies it to the people of Eurasia with the label Caucasoid. It is an exercise in circular thinking. The pre-Neanderthal population of Eurasia is not well enough represented in the fossil record to enable determination of any common genetic origin or significant shared traits. The Maurer mandible, the Steinheim skull, the Swanscombe fragments come down to us as individuals. There is simply not enough material to establish a racial line. The 649 bones of Krapina do show some degree of genetic continuity with the Fontechevade cranium. But Krapina material also shows Mongoloid admixture, and the line thus becomes fuzzy at best. Then, for 60,000 years, this racial line disappears altogether. The Neanderthals dominate Eurasia and disappear, and the original line returns and absorbs Neanderthal genes. No one knows where the original Eurasian people went during the 60,000 years of Neanderthal dominance in Eurasia, and no one knows what other racial genes this original Eurasian population absorbed while it was elsewhere during Worm. There has only been one race in Eurasia in any strict sense, the Neanderthal race. And rather than try to fit Neanderthals into the Caucasoid race, as Kuhn continually does, it seems more reasonable to wonder how much Neanderthal racial traits contributed to the state we now call Caucasoid. Neanderthal faces were, simply huge. Neanderthal faces were twice the size of modern ones, and their heads were about an inch bigger in every direction but up. On a bone-by-bone basis, we have learned that almost every single Neanderthal skeletal characteristic can be matched among living people. The operative word here is can. It would be very difficult to match Neanderthal hands and feet among living Europeans. The bone-by-bone analysis of Neanderthals tends to disguise the truth of the Neanderthal gestalt. We are talking about people with faces twice as large as ours, heads an inch longer and wider, and postcranial bones which can be matched, after a lot of hard looking, with modern people. And all this on a creature about 5 feet 4 inches high. Neanderthal women were quite a bit smaller, barely within the normal European range, and yet their bones can be matched by living Europeans. The Neanderthals were exceedingly squat, heavy little people and grotesque by our standards. There is no way to get around the fact that the Neanderthals differed considerably from later Eurasians. But, as great as the skeletal differences are in terms of gestalt, I think that the flesh appearance of the Neanderthals would likely be more shocking to us yet. And I think that some skeletal details point to this. In Neanderthals, the lower rib cage was very full, or even flared, and this on a chest that was already very deep by modern standards. Then, add to this the fact that Neanderthal pelvic bones, though similar to modern man's in shape, had a tendency to be a bit higher and more flaring. We are left with low flaring ribs and high flaring hips, and these skeletal structures must have had some function. And this function can only have been to support a very round and full trunk. I'm inclined to believe that the Neanderthal body type was, in the flesh, almost absurdly round. This story was uploaded to YouTube by Ink and Panels Manawanas for recaps. If you're enjoying this story, please support us by becoming a subscriber and remember to press the like button. There is some theoretical support for this notion. Allen's rule states the general principle that cold-adapted animals tend to adopt a spherical form while tropical animals tend to be elongated. The rule is more complex than that, but that's what it boils down to for all practical purposes. Being cold-adapted animals, the Neanderthals, like Eskimos, would tend to be short and stocky, but the Neanderthal skeletons argue that they were excessively so compared with modern Eskimos. There is good reason why Neanderthals should have been even rounder than Eskimos according to the dictates of Allen's rule. Anthropology texts are fond of saying that by the time of the Neanderthals, man's culture had evolved to the point where survival under Arctic conditions was barely possible. Before the worm glaciation, it is believed that hominids fled south with the onset of ice ages, but that the Neanderthals held their ground because their Mysterian technology was enough of an advance to permit their survival. It sounds good if you say it fast, but there is something spurious about it. There is nothing easier to borrow than culture traits. If the Neanderthals' Mysterian was the crucial difference, it is difficult to explain why other men did not borrow their Mysterian toolkit and remain to face worm also. We have seen that there were other kinds of men in Eurasia just before the onset of worm. Yet, other kinds of men did not adopt the Neanderthals' Mysterian toolkit. They fled. The worst of the worm glacial period is correlated with a genotype, not with Mysterian tools. This circumstance leads one to suspect that the Mysterian toolkit alone was insufficient to guarantee human survival and that the rigors of the worm ice age demanded a specialized kind of man. Perhaps any toolkit that could have been developed at the human level of evolution 100,000 years ago would have been insufficient to permit survival. There is no doubt that Neanderthal man was much poorer culturally and technically than contemporary Eskimos. Therefore, Neanderthal man survived and flourished during worm because he was adapted to cold more completely than modern Eskimos, and this compensated for his relative cultural and technological poverty compared to them. I believe that Neanderthals must have been a more extreme example of Allen's rule in operation, and they must have been rounder than even our modern Eskimos. I think it is reasonable to conclude that Neanderthal ribs and hips reflect this. Yet, I'm not altogether sure that increased roundness, by itself, would have been enough. I think that there is at least scanty evidence for more dramatic adaptations, but I don't want to go into this yet. Perhaps the assumption that physical adaptations, rather than cultural ones, made the difference during the last ice age can offer some insights into apparent discontinuities. Sapiens in the modern morphological form had appeared in Eurasia before the onset of worm, but there is no evidence for a comparable cultural advance. Because we've more or less assumed that culture and physical evolution go hand in hand, We've been puzzled by the Neanderthals who appear to represent a physical regression but a cultural advance. If physical adaptations were the crucial factor, the puzzle disappears. The Neanderthals were a physical advance for the specific conditions of worm, and their cultural advance was simply the minimal toolkit necessary to exploit their physical adaptations. Assuming for the moment that Neanderthals may have been extremely round little people, and perhaps it will be granted that their skeletal material hints at this, I don't think that roundness by itself was enough. I'm inclined to believe that the Neanderthals boasted a thick, woolly fleece, a pelt, and there is some reason to believe that the dominant color of this fleece was a reddish-brown. Before going into evidence for a Neanderthal fleece, and it is embarrassingly threadbare and perhaps even unacceptable to any remotely reputable anthropologist, something should be said about the theoretical support for this notion, such as it is. We have noted the observation of Byblos that the Neanderthals had a fairly high percentage of geriatrics in their population. About 35% of the Neanderthal population was represented by the age group 30 to 60. Surprisingly, considering the comparative levels of technology and comparative environments, Byblos found that the technically more advanced Upper Paleolithics could support about 30% fewer geriatrics, and the even more advanced Mesolithics could support 60% fewer geriatrics compared to the Neanderthals. There must be some reason for this discontinuity. We know that the Mesolithics, at least, could sew clothing because we have found their awls which were used to punch thread holes, or, more likely, sinew holes, in skins. We may suspect that the Upper Paleolithics sewed too, although we have no proof, and it might even be granted that the Neanderthals used their characteristic Mysterian burins for worrying thread holes in skins. However, no one doubts that the Mesolithics enjoyed a richer material culture than the Neanderthals. Why, then, could the Mesolithics not support their senior citizens in greater numbers? Since the significant environmental and survival challenge was identical for all three peoples, that is to say, of the various phases of worm, one is led to conclude that the Neanderthals were better equipped to meet this challenge. Since their better equipment cannot reasonably be ascribed to culture, it must have been supplied by nature. A natural pelt is more efficient than a man-made coat, and it is just possible that the Neanderthals lived longer because they had better protection from the elements. Perhaps it is not carrying this line of reasoning too far to suggest that the Upper Paleolithics were able to support a greater number of geriatrics than the Mesolithics, because the Upper Paleolithics were closer to the Neanderthals in time, possibly reflected Neanderthal cold-adapted traits through interbreeding, and thus enjoyed some natural protection that the later Mesolithics had lost. His eyes told me nothing. They were dull and empty, the eyes of an animal, and he seemed to me like an animal and nothing more. I gave the verbal conclusion that this was no disguised person, but a wild man of some kind. Then I returned to my unit and never heard of him again. Karapetyan, in retrospect, gives the man's height as 180 centimeters, or about 5 feet 10.5 inches, which is outside the range of pure, classical Neanderthals. But Karapetyan stresses its massiveness compared to the body trim of local people, and his estimate of the creature's height, in retrospect, may have been slightly exaggerated to match the man's outsized proportions in other respects. At any rate, similar creatures reported by other observers in the Caucasus area are stated to be about 5 feet in height. They are called captor by the modern inhabitants. In July 1957, Professor V.K. Leontiev, a biologist with the Ministry of Hunting of Dagestan ASSR, was conducting an official survey of the Gaghan sanctuary at the head of the Jermut River when he saw a captor. It should be said here that the Jermut River Valley is a particularly wild area, uninhabited by modern men. Its fauna includes moose, some surviving European bison or wisent, red deer, mountain sheep, brown bear, wolf, lynx, and leopards. Tigers do not range quite as far as the Jermut, but occur in the Elburz Mountains not far to the south. Carlton Kuhn reported tigers in the vicinity of his Byzantine cave excavation in the Elburz. Neanderthal skeletal material and Mysterian flints were recovered at Byzantine. Leontiev's report is long, detailed, and objective. It is too long to reproduce in full here, and the reader is referred to the source. Number 120, Report 3, Special Commission to Study the Snowman of the USSR Academy of Sciences, under the direction of Professor B.F. Porshnev and Dr. A. Shmakov, 1959, Moscow. Leontief saw his captor at a distance of approximately 50 to 60 meters, and it was in view for 5 to 7 minutes. The sighting occurred in the late afternoon under generally good weather conditions, although a light snow was falling. According to Leontief, the captor he saw tallied perfectly with descriptions of the creature current among local mountain folk. It was about 1.6 meters in height, about 5 feet 2 or 3 inches, and had an unusually wide body covered with dark hair. Its feet were very heavy, broad, and about 9 inches in length. The head was massive. The captor's back was slightly bent, and its shoulders were slightly stooped. Leontief described the creature as a massively built man. After viewing the captor for some time, Leontief took a shot at it, but missed. Leontief traced and measured the captor's footprints in light snow, but acknowledges that these prints do not represent the true shape of the foot because the creature had been walking away from him, uphill, and put most of its weight on the toes. The heel part of the prints was not well defined, but the prints were of generally human shape. The captor made several cries, but Leontief could distinguish no words. Traveling east along the Elbers, we find that Daniel Dotson reported that a gorilla had been killed in Iran during the 1940s. Dotson was an engineer with an American oil company. There is no further information on this report. Continuing east across Afghanistan, the Uzbek, Tajik, Kyrgyz, and Kazakh SSRs, and across the Badakhshan Autonomous Area, there are literally hundreds of reports of creatures similar to the Caucasus captor. Most of these reports were collected by the 1958 Russian expedition. Depending upon the local language, these creatures are called Gulbayatan, Dev, Almas. In general, witnesses say that they are the size of a small man, covered with reddish-brown hair or fur, have very broad and heavy feet, and seem to have a primitive form of language. Caves are their favorite homes, and they have been seen to use simple tools. Porshnev found a footprint of a Gulyavan in the mud in Kyrgyz. Since it was obvious that the Neanderthals had inhabited the fringes of these mountains only 30,000 to 40,000 years ago, and since living creatures apparently resembling Neanderthals were reported continuously from these mountains, there was a suspicion that the two phenomena might somehow be related. It has not been proved that Neanderthals in a more or less pure form survive yet, but there is at least some provocative evidence that they may. And, if so, it makes sense that isolated survivors would have been forced, by the pressure of modern man, to retreat into uninhabited areas of the Caucasus, Pamir Elbers, and Altai, overlooking their former homes. It is possible that not all the Neanderthals were assimilated. It is likely that some Neanderthal groups, those living in cultural backwaters like the Zagros and the Pamir Elbers, which were far removed from the initial and major migration routes of the Upper Paleolithics into Eurasia, retained their genetic purity for a long time. Too long. It is possible that by the time modern man got around to inhabiting these backwaters, there was too much cultural difference between Neanderthals and the newcomers to permit interbreeding. If that occurred in places, then the Neanderthals would have been forced to retreat to extremely inaccessible environments where they could barely survive, but where modern man could not, at least not in any numbers. And if the Almas and the captor seem a bit too primitive to be Neanderthals, it may be that they have suffered the refugees' regression as other peoples have. My point is not to try to prove the continued existence of Neanderthals. The issue at stake is their hairiness. If it is at least arguable that Neanderthals, or their degenerated descendants, may survive and have been reported by Eurasian people, we must note that these creatures are always reported to be hairy, and the bulk of descriptions insist on a reddish-brown color. Before concluding the argument for Neanderthal hairiness per se, and before proceeding to the much more important question of Neanderthal sexual dimorphism, I would like to recall, for a moment, those geriatric ratios. There is a subtlety in these ratios which very nearly proves the case for a substantial Neanderthal pelt. A number of Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic Eurasian peoples were sturdily built, short and stocky, and especially those peoples who were big-game hunters and who followed the Arctic fauna north as worm glaciation retreated. Indeed, in an effort to explain the rather bewildering multiplicity of body types in Europe, it used to be thought that there were 3 distinct races which migrated into, or differentiated after arriving in, Europe. This naive anthropological cliché, as Kuhn calls it, maintained that the Cro-Magnons were Caucasoid, the Grimaldis Negroid, and the Chanslade people Eskimoid. Some of the European people were as stocky as Eskimos, and probably almost as stocky as the Neanderthals. An Eskimoid race was proposed to explain them. So, in Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic Europe, we have people who, like the Eskimos of today and the Neanderthals of the further past, were roundly cold-adapted according to the tenets of Allen's rule. Yet, even though these Eskimoids were adapted almost as much as the Neanderthals in roundness, they had a decreasingly significant percentage of old people in their populations. They did not live as long as the Neanderthals and were less well adapted. It is obvious that a stocky body type was not the only Neanderthal adaptation to cold. The fact that the Neanderthals could support 3 times the number of elderly as Mesolithics, and 1/3 more elderly than Upper Paleolithics, strongly suggests another dramatic adaptation to cold conditions. As we have said, this adaptation could not have been cultural because Upper Paleolithics and Mesolithics had a richer cultural assemblage than the Neanderthals' Mysterian. This additional cold adaptation was supplied by nature. And everything we know about Arctic adaptation in other kinds of terrestrial mammals insists that this additional adaptation must have been fur. And, in passing, there is no need to postulate 3 races in Europe in order to account for great variations in body types at different times. The modern men who came into Eurasia at the close of Wormi, during the Gottweg interstadial, came from the south. There is no reason why some of these men should not have shown strongly Negroid characteristics, but there would have been absolutely no reason for any of them to have been stocky and squat. Coming from the warmer south, these men too would have reflected Allen's rule. In general, all of them should have been taller and thinner than the Neanderthals. I suggest that the range of body types in Europe can be very easily explained by the degree to which these newcomers interbred with Neanderthals, and the degree to which climate and geography tended to favor Neanderthal characteristics in the resulting composite population. This picture has been considerably muddied by even more recent migrations undertaken by men with the invention of agriculture. One school, generally older and flourishing a few decades ago, maintained that the Neanderthals' primitive characteristics reflected the traits of Eastern Homo erectus, which migrated into Eurasia from Southeast Asia. That is, that the Neanderthals looked primitive because they were primitive hominids. The newer school of anthropological thought, represented by the thinking of Kuhn and, perhaps, Seletsky, maintains that the Neanderthals were only primitive-looking and that their distinctive traits resulted mostly from special adaptations. It may be that both emphases are somewhat correct. Perhaps the Neanderthals began as relatively primitive hominids compared to people living in Eurasia during the last interglacial, and that their more primitive characteristics were reinforced by glacial adaptation until reaching an extreme form. If the Neanderthals were originally somewhat closer to the apes as a relatively primitive hominid, it might be justifiable to speculate that Caucasoid aggression may mirror the ape's lower frustration tolerance. But this would be a far-fetched explanation. The hominid line is not all that new, as was once thought, and our separation from ape-like ancestors is receding ever further into the past. Adequate explanation for our behavior can be found by going only a relatively short distance back into our evolutionary history. If it is granted that the Neanderthals were squat and hairy, and that Caucasoids retain vestiges of Neanderthal traits, then it must also be granted that the sexes do not share these vestigial traits equally. It can be fairly said that one additional Caucasoid characteristic that serves to distinguish us from other kinds of men is the degree of sexual dimorphism in our race. Caucasoids all have a tendency to be hairy, and all men of whatever race have a tendency to be hairier than women, but our men are much hairier than our women. Likewise, Caucasoids have a tendency toward heavy bones and a certain broadness of body, but our women have broader pelvises than women of other races. The Caucasoid difference in height between the sexes is somewhat greater than is the case in other races. We recognize this sexual dimorphism in phrases like the fair sex in comparing our women to our men, or when a woman is called a broad. This rather unusual degree of dimorphism, this sexism, to use a modern word, is a Caucasoid character. Perhaps this sexual dimorphism is another vestigial inheritance from the Neanderthals. We recall that Neanderthals exhibited a relatively great degree of sexual dimorphism in height and in cranial capacity. Neanderthal women were somewhat disproportionately short. Yet, these women had to give birth to children of a race which had bigger heads than modern man. It is likely that Neanderthal infants had somewhat larger heads than modern babies. Neanderthal infant skeletal material is scarce. We have two skeletons, one from Shanidar and one from Stericeli, and both are badly crushed. However, the skull of the Stericeli infant is more massive than the skulls of modern babies. Kuhn says that the vault is thick for an 18-month-old baby, especially the lower part of the forehead, and that the forehead is high and steep and somewhat bulbous. It is even more strongly rounded and bowed forward than most modern baby skulls of the same age. Yet, in spite of its massiveness, the Stericeli infant was a very late Neanderthal, if wholly Neanderthal at all, and shows evidence of intrusion of more modern stock. It is either an early example of modern Caucasoid Homo sapiens, a product of mixture with local Neanderthals, or the end result of an evolutionary progression from Neanderthal to modern man. It would seem reasonable, therefore, that infant skulls of classically extreme Neanderthals would have been even more massive than that of the transitional infant of Stericeli. And yet, these infants had to pass through the pelvic bones of exceptionally small women. It would seem that there had to be some sort of pelvic adaptation to permit birth. First, of course, the Neanderthal women were stocky and had visibly wide hips for their size. But hips can only become so wide before the articulation of the legs becomes exceedingly clumsy. We may conclude that the interior of the pelvic bone, the rim of the pelvis, had to be widened without widening the gross dimensions of the bone too much. This can be accomplished by a different configuration of the interior of the pelvic bone and by thinner bone, and this is the direction Neanderthal female pelvises take. Stewart found that the Shanidar pelvic bones, especially the pubic bones, were thinner than in modern man. Modern European women have internal pelvic dimensions that are larger than those of women of other races. In Europeans, the rim of the pelvis may be up to an inch larger in diameter than the norm for other races. We have inherited our women's hippiness from the Neanderthals. Neanderthal-like traits would tend to be reselected, and European women would have appeared to be extremely large-hipped. We may therefore take issue with the opinion of Paleolithic art experts who tend to believe that Venus figurines were symbolic and abstract rather than naturalistic. All of these figurines date from cold periods during Worm II and Worm III when Allen's rule and inherited Neanderthal characteristics would have combined to produce European women of disproportionate stockiness and hippiness. Art experts often say that these cannot be naturalistic representations because the extremities, the hands and feet, appear perfunctory, to use the word of Andreas Lommel. But the hands and feet of an excessively fat woman can appear perfunctory. There is a curious detail in most of these figures that is definitely not perfunctory and seems to be faithful naturalism. The hair shown on most of these figurines, and especially on the Venus of Willendorf, is faithfully reproduced and hints at purposeful styling. The faithful reproduction of a hairdo would seem most unnecessary for a purely abstract figure of fertility. Human beings have made abstract fertility figures, of course, but the Venuses of the Upper Paleolithic would not seem to be of that genre. The Kronos complex. If a satisfactory explanation of Caucasoid female hippiness has possibly been given, no reason has yet been offered why Caucasoid men should be so much more hairy than Caucasoid women. Nor has any reason been given for the large breasts characteristic of Caucasoid women. Perhaps it is time to try this, but it will require a detour into philosophical biology. When the discussion of sexual dimorphism is returned to, there will be a greater insight into the causes of Caucasoid aggression. Man has always realized that he, too, is an animal in some ways, and yet different. Human observation, even on the lowest level of culture, leaves no room for doubt that man seems to be unique in the animal world. Some men, and perhaps this would include most of the world's population, are capable of accepting this difference and have proposed explanations for it which appear to be truly satisfying. But other men have proved not so easily sated. The Caucasoids by and large belong in this group, and have continued to wonder why man differs from other species in the purely natural world. It is not necessary to go deeply into the various explanations that Caucasoids have embraced in order to account for man's uniqueness. We have been created in God's image. We have descended from space travelers, according to a more recent explanation proffered by von Daniken and others. Since Darwin, Wallace, and Haeckel, our official Western explanatory institution, science, has held that we evolved from lower primates. It was fashionable a few years back to believe that science had increased our uncertainty and alienation because it destroyed mythic explanations for our origins, which were psychologically satisfying. But our notions of special creation were never truly satisfying. The creative powers ascribed to the Titans and Olympians did not prevent Anaximander and Aristotle and Archimedes and many others from doubting. And churchmen could not regard Jehovah's creative powers as sufficiently definitive because they continued to debate the nature and rank of various angels, their size and weight, the dimensions of heaven, whether God had supplied souls to other animals, and whether the Christ was essentially a material or a spiritual entity. Von Daniken's offering of space-traveling ancestors does not solve the problem of our uniqueness, but merely postpones it. What made them unique in whatever world they originated? We have, therefore, never really accounted for our undoubted uniqueness in the animal world in a way which puts our minds at ease and which truly satisfies our curiosity. It must be admitted that the scientific explanation, evolution, is probably a bit less satisfying than others because evolution does not recognize a difference, but only numberless degrees of difference between ourselves and other animals. Scientists have offered the explanation that we have large brains and more intelligence than other animals, that we have a more complex culture than other animals, that we have a greater consciousness. And this may indeed be true, and an adequate explanation for our uniqueness in the natural world, but not one of these terms has been adequately defined in biological terms, and we began as a purely biological animal, according to evolution. A dictionary may define intelligence as the ability to learn and understand or to deal with new or trying situations, and consciousness as simply awareness. The English anthropologist Edward Taylor defines culture as that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, morals, custom, and other capabilities acquired by man as a member of society. Jackdaws compete to mate with high-ranking males. Jackdaws are monogamous and mate for life. The males compete for relative dominance early in life and establish a rank order much like the pecking order of barnyard hens. After the males have sorted themselves out, the females compete for marriage with high-ranking males. This process ensures that superior males will mate with superior females, average males with average females, inferior males with inferior females. Because jackdaw dominance confers very definite material advantages, just as the pecking order confers the same in the barnyard, lower-ranking pairs, the least successful in the jackdaw world, will tend to die off and therefore leave fewer progeny. The best jackdaw genes are preserved and favored because the best breed with the best and because the best get the most of life's requirements. Territory, usually claimed and defended by aggression, is a selective mechanism designed to allow favorable characteristics to assert themselves. If a biological look is taken at the behavior which makes us unique in the animal world, it can be explained by territoriality expressed in a unique dimension, time. Like other primates, we indulge in group defense of territory, and we indulge in struggles for social status and the benefits it confers. But, unlike other primates, and unlike any other animal, we do this in the past, present, and future. As a very simple example, a scientist, artist, writer, or musician may compete with someone who is already dead by seeking to create a better theory of mechanics than Newton, paint a better picture than Rembrandt, write the great American novel, and displace Melville's Moby Dick. Or a musician may wish to express something more profound than Strauss's Also sprach Zarathustra, and perhaps come up with 5 notes that more dramatically express human searching. At some point, a hominid conceived the notion that his dead fellows still had a relationship with him. If we wish to pinpoint the significant difference between ourselves and other animals, we only have to say that man conceived of time. Our true specific name should be Homo temporalis. It is not pretended to know how or why this happened. Perhaps it has something to do with intelligence. Perhaps the conception is only possible with a certain size of brain, a critical number of synapses. But whatever intelligence has to do with it, the recognition of a past, present, and future of one's kind beyond the twin barriers of birth and death which delineate any one lifetime. That is consciousness. Non-genetic communication across these barriers is culture. When this explanation of basic human beginnings was first offered in the Chronos Complex I, published in 1973, it was necessary to assume that early man did, indeed, possessed the capacity to conceive of time. The assumption was based solely upon the existence of purposeful burial among Neanderthals and the metaphysical implications of interment. During the years of research, 1967 to 1972, no one had been encountered who had discovered hard evidence of time-factored activity among the cultures of early man. There was no such evidence at that time. Ironically, that evidence was supplied in the same year that the Chronos complex I was finalized in manuscript form and was in the process of publication. But ignorance of this evidence remained for almost 6 years, something which is bitterly regretted because that evidence, if it had been included, would have strengthened considerably the structure of sheer speculation that was the Chronos complex I. And the evidence could have been included. In 1972, Alexander Marshak's The Roots of Civilization was published, and it provided the proof that early men, even as early as the Neanderthals, had been capable of conceptualizing time and capable of recording it. As so often happens with an important breakthrough, the research Marshak originally undertook was intended for something else and directed toward a different goal entirely. He was initially writing a book for NASA about space travel, which is about as far as it is possible to get from paleontology. Marshak's task was to explain man's progress from the beginnings to the space age. The developments of recent specific technology permitting space travel posed no particular problems for Marshak, but the beginnings of technology and civilization did. Marshak found himself doubting the established view of both the date of human civilized beginnings and the established timetable of civilized development. The established view was that man made very little conceptual or technological progress until he settled down to experiment with farming and town life, until the time of the Neolithic Revolution. According to the contemporary view of human development, man's civilized and cultural start began in the Neolithic. The trouble with this view, and the cause of Marshak's doubt, is that the Neolithic was not so very long ago, and when some men turned to farming and town life about 7000 BC, they did so with a fairly sophisticated knowledge of time, measurement, and technology. The intelligence, once begun, tends to become a geometrical function. In time, other havens besides religion were structured for exceptional intelligence. Shamans became priests, and priests invented writing so that we could not only communicate with the dead, but leave messages for the yet-to-be born. Probably, persons of exceptional temporal awareness broached the idea of growing food and raising animals against future need. Eventually, artists, musicians, writers, and people who could supervise labor and administer the group for still greater efficiency, greater opportunity for existing in the intellectual world, could be supported. It is not difficult to see how we came from the first gravesite, the Neanderthal burial at Le Moustier 50,000 or 60,000 years ago, to the present level of technology. The non-genetic way in which we communicate with past and future and bind them into a continuity with the present is culture. Culture is thought of as good, but it is not wholly so. It is a remarkable biological adaptation allowing the communication of minds and hearts across the barriers of birth and death, and it is precious insofar as it allows us to love more fully and more deeply. But culture is also the medium of communication of aggression and across the same biological barriers. We are territorial animals. Having claimed time and established contact with the past and the future, our territorial behavior demanded that we invent ways of protecting ourselves from both. The territory of each human generation, each present tense, had to be asserted with respect to the past and defended with respect to the future. Each generation must strive for a place in the pecking order of history. Each generation must strive to be unique. Each generation must progress with respect to the past and prevent the younger generation from progressing with respect to itself. The past must be surpassed, and the future must be held back. As was said many pages ago, mechanisms were developed to hold the future back and prevent its being significantly different from ourselves in order to protect our present tense identities. Warfare, morals, custom, caste systems, and the tradition of hereditary occupations are, or can be, future-limiting mechanisms. It is obvious that we surpass the past through technological and cultural progress. We develop those things which the past did not and assert our unique identity. The opinion was given many pages ago that the crises of the contemporary world have the following psychobiological profile. Activities which were once wholly past surpassing, like industry and technology, were found to have inherent future-limiting possibilities. These, allied to traditional future-limiting mechanisms, have brought the world to the brink of several simultaneous disasters. We live in a world where the future is not only threatened by war, it is threatened by progress. It was maintained in the Chronos complex that all men share temporal aggression and the penchant for progress, although it is obvious that we do not all exhibit the same degree of temporally motivated behavior. There are two major factors which can modify this behavior: environment and sexual sensual adaptation. Some groups of men had the misfortune to be indigenous to, or were forced to migrate into, geographical areas which offered harsh environments generally or which posed special problems. In these cases, the difficulty of physical or cultural survival was a limiting factor to the preservation of a critical mass of intelligence. Some environments, either through harshness and lack of resources or because of geographical peculiarities, kept human groups too small to achieve the division of labor necessary to a sufficiently large intelligence pool, which would lead to high culture or civilization. Australia and Tasmania are examples of exceptionally harsh environments. Aborigine groups are very small and are forced to be nomadic because the land will support very few people per square mile. Under such conditions, Australoid culture could never get off the ground, and the full human potential for temporal communication was never reached. The Aborigines remained restricted to a very primitive past-present orientation. They never had an opportunity to develop the present-future communication that comes with writing. The Polynesians represent a human group thwarted by a sufficiently rich environment, but one with restrictive geographical characteristics. The Polynesians were apparently forced to migrate out into the Pacific, where numerous islands, some of which were extremely favorable for human habitation and some of which were marginal, dispersed this people into relatively small groups. Communication was maintained between the islands, thanks to an immensely complex navigational culture, and a degree of linguistic and cultural cohesiveness was preserved against all odds, but the diffused population never reached critical mass in any one place. The Polynesians were, however, considerably more fortunate environmentally than the Australian Aborigines and were able to develop a very sophisticated past-present culture. If the Easter Islanders had not cut down all their trees, they might have achieved writing and full present-future communication. And what about Caucasoids? Perhaps, after this long biophilosophical detour, it will be easy to see that nature's sexual adaptations conflicted in large measure with Neanderthal glacial adaptations, and easy to see the grave implications of this. It may be assumed that the Neanderthals were not naked apes, like other men, or at least not nearly so naked. They needed their pelt for sheer survival. Neanderthals were robbed of some tactile sensitivity. In the interests of cold-weather survival, Neanderthals could not sport vulnerable extremities. No larger penis for them, no Hottentot apron. Still, nature did what it could. Insofar as was possible, the women became less hairy and perhaps, in compensation, even a little rounder. Breasts, on this body type, would have to become greatly exaggerated in order to fulfill their tactile and stimulatory function. Neanderthal men were hairier by far than their women, while the women may have been extremely plump and large-breasted. It will be noted in passing that female Captor and Almas are reported to have very large breasts for their size and to be less hairy than the males. If this was the case, and Neanderthal sexual adaptations followed this train of logic, then it is easy to see how Caucasoids look the way we do. Our sexual dimorphism is great and affects the general appearance of the sexes and not just the sex organs. To hark back for a moment to the Venus figurines, there is now more theoretical reason to believe that they truly reflected glacial female bodies. Vestiges of Neanderthal dimorphism are retained. Our men are considerably hairier than our women. Our women are shorter, hippie, and large-breasted. Nature did what it could considering survival characteristics that could not be altered, but the inadequate sexual sensual adaptations caused another problem while only partially alleviating the original one. The Neanderthals already had a high degree of sexual dimorphism, and the patchwork sexual adaptations only emphasized it. The sexes likely looked different enough that each tended to regard the other as something of a distinct species. There may have been grave difficulties in each sex recognizing the other to be completely human. Among the Neanderthals, there could not have been as much sexual solidarity as among other races of man. Even the lesser Caucasoid degree of sexual dimorphism has resulted in a noticeable amount of sexual conflict. Long before Lysistrata and Aristophanes, Caucasoids must have been aware of a continual, low-grade war of the sexes. Caucasoid sexes have never really got used to each other, never really completely trusted each other. Given the delicate balance of approach avoidance generated by temporal territorial behavior and the aggression surrounding sexual encounters, it is obvious that a high degree of sexual dimorphism would tend to heighten the very aggression and frustration that sexual adaptations were intended to absorb. An interview with Susan Braunmüller, author of Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape, is remembered. Braunmüller was describing rape, accurately, as a crime of violence and power. Rape is sexual aggression. If memory serves, the interviewer was Barbara Frum, and the show was CBC Radio's As It Happens. Frum asked Braunmüller at the end of the interview, "What have men got against women?" Braunmüller answered, "I wish I knew." The temporal aggression surrounding human reproduction is the answer. Because males have generally been more territorially assertive, it would seem reasonable that males would be more temporally aggressive than females and would approach the act of reproduction and the consequences with a greater degree of anger and frustration. This might be normal to all human males, but increased sexual dimorphism could be expected to provoke greater sexual aggression. Therefore, it might be a valid assumption that rape within major groups would likely occur most frequently among Caucasoids, while rapes between major groups in time of conflict would be more common. It is relevant, if disturbing, to note here that Marshak's study of European cave art uncovered much evidence of violence directed toward females, and especially pregnant females, in company with time-factored notations. A drawing of a pregnant mare in the cave of La Pileta, Malaga, shows several sets of double wound marks painted on the mare's stomach. These marks were made at different times and may represent ritual violence practiced at seasonal ceremonies. Marks corresponding to the wound marks applied to the mare at La Pileta have also been discovered on Venus figurines depicting pregnant women. The marks, which are also time-factored notations, occur on the breasts and stomachs of the figurines. It may be that the marks applied to the figurines were duplicated by wounds on real women, for the same reasons and in the same places. Such marks may, in fact, give a clue about the significance of the Iceman Inheritance. Part 3. The Iceman Inheritance. Culture. It is difficult to find either words or concepts analogous to love among the languages and people of Africa and the New World. Indeed, it has been the proud claim that in addition to the gospel, Christian missionaries introduced love to previously benighted non-Western peoples. Perhaps it is time to analyze the notion of love from a psychobiological perspective. As a more or less uniquely Western invention, love must somehow be connected with our evolutionary experience and with our peculiar motivational requirements. If the argument that territorial behavior in the dimension of time must cause ambivalence towards sex and reproduction is tentatively accepted, and if the corollary proposition that aggression and frustration result from this ambivalence is accepted, then the identity of love begins to take shape. If the argument that Western man suffers more sexual reproductive aggression and frustration due to glacial adaptations conflicting with sexual ones is further accepted, then it becomes clear why love is so important in the West. Love is that middle ground between aggression and the ability to reproduce. Love is that place where one can feel unthreatened in sex, and the place where one can have sex without directing aggression toward a partner. The place where sex and respect can coexist for both oneself and one's partner. Given the greater degree of reproductive threat for Western man, and given the greater degree of consequent frustration and aggression, that place called love can be very small and exclusive, but of utmost personal importance. It is not surprising, therefore, that love dominates our prose, our poetry, the lyrics of pop songs, and much day-to-day conversation. The necessity of finding that small area of truce where the imperative of reproduction balances fear and aggression is the primary task of each Western individual, and the importance of that search is reflected throughout all levels of our culture. When the search is successful, a pair bond is formed. The fact that a pair bond is, simultaneously, a gravitation towards sexual reproduction and a mutual escape from aggression has been well known to students of both animal and human behavior for a long time. A pair bond, love, is displaced aggression. It is aggression shoved aside, literally, so that the partners can reproduce without threat. Love and expression. Courtship is the subtle process whereby initial and natural aggression is turned aside so that, in the end, the courting partners stand side by side to face the world with their combined and allied aggression directed outward. Courtship can be a lengthy and anxiety-provoking process in the West. Falling in love is a more or less traumatic event filled with uncertainties, lovers' quarrels, playful fighting, etc. The courtship antics of Western man differ little from the courtship process common to all pair-bonding species. Konrad Lorenz has studied the courtship ceremonies of creatures as diverse as cichlid fishes and geese, and has demonstrated through behavioral analysis that courtship ceremonies are ritualized fighting. The courting partners begin their relationship by aggressive sparring with each other, with fighting motions directed toward each other. But, as courtship progresses, the aggressive movements are directed increasingly to the side of the partner until, eventually, the courting pair find themselves side by side with their combined aggression directed outwards. Their aggression has been displaced, in a very literal sense and by movements which can be measured, until the pair stands together in a small place free of aggression or threat emanating from either toward the other. The fascinating analysis of this process is fully covered in Konrad Lorenz's On Aggression under the chapter entitled The Bond. The interesting problem in applying aggressive pair bonding to human beings as a whole is that human beings are closely related to a group of animals, the great apes, which are not, strictly speaking, always pair-bonded. Among the great apes, only the gibbon appears to be strictly pair-bonded. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans all show some modest tendency toward polygamy. Although man is morphologically related to the great apes, man's natural habitat and some aspects of his morphology would seemingly place him closer in psyche to some of the ground-living apes like baboons and drills, and these apes are not at all monogamous. Regarded in their totality before the enforced dominance of Western culture, human beings exhibited a rather modest tendency toward polygamy, like the other anthropoid apes. Occasionally, human beings insisted upon the more exuberant polygamy characteristic of the ground apes. Only in the West has monogamy been consistently, and at least nominally, enshrined as the norm. We may wonder why this is, and why both are called love, even though it is realized that the two concepts are, in some ways, opposites. Perhaps a glimmering of an answer will be obtained by returning to the Chronos complex and the beginning of temporal awareness. As was said earlier, man's recognition of time forced conflicting realizations upon humanity. Man became aware of a continuum that transcended birth and death and realized that each individual was a part of that eternal continuum. At the same time, and in spite of being a part of eternity, man's thought, energy, and behavior were also mortgaged to the brutal business of surviving and reproducing in the biological and material world. The conception of time was, and is, a brutal and soul-tearing reality. There is the desire to become a part of a gentle human continuity consisting of past, present, future relationships and reunions with those who have died and those yet to be born. And at the same time, there is the biological necessity to survive and to assert our temporal territory so that we may reproduce and preserve that continuity. The paradox and the irony is that to preserve the continuity biologically, our territorial mechanisms force us to do violence to nature, our fellow men, and to the integrity of the continuity itself. Territorial law demands that the territory must be defended before we gain the identity and the confidence to reproduce. But, with temporal territory, our territorial adversaries are our own past and future, the dead and the yet-to-be-born whom we love. The outlines of agape become biologically clear. Just as the love called eros allows us to reproduce in the face of threat and aggression, so the love called agape allows us to live in the material world while yearning for the relationships awaiting us in eternity. Agape is that place where the needs of material survival are met while the realization of a past, present, future continuity is preserved. It is worth noting that agape has never been as popular as eros. Most people are capable of negotiating some form of love, permitting more or less aggression-free reproduction, but fewer people are capable of appreciating agape, the love of life itself. One has to be sensitive enough to be aware of the continuity of past, present, future, and one has to be relatively non-territorial in terms of biological behavior, in order to appreciate the love called agape. And those conditions mean, by biological definition, that the individual possessing those characteristics will likely be non-reproductive. It should not be surprising, therefore, to learn that the love called agape is that thing which celibate priests and religious functionaries are always, and more or less vainly, trying to explain to Eros-dominated Western man. It has been seen that the high level of sexual reproductive ambivalence among Neanderthal Caucasoids is such that even successful Eros is very difficult to attain. It may be excused, perhaps, for failing to attain an appreciation of agape in significant numbers. It may be granted now that love, including both agape and eros, are special adaptations of Western man demanded by his psychobiology. If they have not been invented by other groups of mankind, and they have not, it is because the rest of mankind does not require these adaptations. The non-Western majority of mankind is not so aggressive. The non-Western majority of mankind does not share the Neanderthal Caucasoid maladaptations. Without love, non-Western peoples have proved able to reproduce in a relatively untraumatic manner according to socially convenient conventions. They have made do with the notion of compassion and with the reverence for stability. Loveless, the majority of mankind has succeeded in constructing enduring societies of an environmentally tolerable nature. With love, we have done much worse. It is at least arguable that what the world needs now is not sweet love. Love as a symptom of, and compensation for, Western psychobiological maladaptation has done at least as much harm as good. On a purely personal and intersexual level, love is, as certain feminists have noted, a four-letter word. Much connected with the Western notion of love has proved inhumane. It was observed many pages ago that the territorial urge in most species works through the male. In human beings, the temporal territorial urge apparently operates mostly through the male, and the frequency of aberrant male psychosexual activity, which indicates the strength of sexual reproductive ambivalence, has been noted. In Western man, this is even more pronounced, as has been seen. It is not particularly surprising, therefore, that the negotiation of the truce of love permitting more or less aggression-free reproduction has often taken the form of female surrender, rather than an equal truce. Our Western notion of love has traditionally involved immense restrictions upon female behavior and the development of female social rights and individual personalities. The perfecti preached no formal religious creed. Rather, they were teachers and masters in the Buddhist or Eastern manner. Ascetic and virtuous themselves, they encouraged the development of tolerance and compassion toward all fellow men and women and toward non-human species. Catharism, as the Albigensian heresy was called, was an appealing philosophy that captivated Europe's nobility and intelligentsia. In spite of the destruction of the civilization built upon Catharism, the philosophy itself and its literature survived to influence Western thinkers and even some priests. Gentle Saint Francis was, by the evidence of contemporary writers, a cathar, as well as a Catholic deacon. With a gentle climate and a gentle and humanistic philosophy, Catharism in southern France blossomed into a prosperous and enlightened civilization centered in the area of Montségur. Too prosperous, too enlightened. Catharism and the Albigensian civilization might have been left alone to flourish in peace in one small, mountainous corner of Europe had the culture not called attention to itself with the creation of a literary form so beautiful that it immediately enraptured barbaric Europe, even if the message of that literature was rarely understood. The literary form that evolved in the French province of Languedoc, a.e. Langue-d'Oc, tongue of the West, was a poetry in the vernacular which we have come to call, in gross distortion, poems of courtly love. But the original meaning of the Albigensian amour courtois can be more correctly rendered as gentle love, as opposed to that rather ungentle and restrictive love that has been analyzed, and which is characteristic of the West. Troubadours from Languedoc, and later from other areas embracing Catharism, spread across Europe as minstrels and sang their ballads about the kind of regard and compassion that could be applied to women specifically and to life in general. Often, as a literary device, life and the human spirit were personified in a woman's name and the ballad of compassion and respect sung to her. There is little doubt that, in addition to the message of compassion and respect, Many of the ballads also referred allegorically to the old, pre-Christian worship of the Earth Mother. Courtly love, as proselytized by the troubadours, turned Europe's eyes toward the Cathar civilization of southern France. There, the Norman barons of the north saw a rich and militarily weak culture ripe for the picking. There, the church saw heresy. The male-dominated Catholic Church saw male and female completed ones held in equal respect, saw a way of life so successful and brilliant without the benefit of male-dominated Christian dogma that it must be destroyed. More especially, the destruction of the perfecti was necessary because the corrupt clergy of the Church suffered by comparison with the undoubted virtue, asceticism, and integrity of the Albigensian teachers. A crusade, the first crusade of many, was initiated by Pope Alexander II in 1163. It was the first time that Western psychosexual and religious intolerance was institutionalized as the proper spiritual orientation of an entire continent. One historian, Maurice Mager, has declared that the Holy War against the Albigensians was the greatest single turning point in the religious history of mankind. Mager may be correct if it is considered that the First Crusade began a justification for Western expansion that was not discredited until the middle of the 20th century, when missionary zeal lost much of its currency. It should not be forgotten that the nominal justification for all European colonialism was, originally, religious. Africa, the New World, and the Far East were invaded and exploited under the pretext of saving the souls of the natives. The war against the Albigensians was the first step in institutionalizing and justifying expansive Western psychosexual intolerance and aggression. Norman troops under the command of Simon de Montfort destroyed the Albigensian civilization. Terrible cruelty was unleashed against the real enemy of the Church, the free women perfecti. The psychosexual nature of the conflict demanded that the women perfecti die at flaming stakes or in agony on the rack. Western man, that creature pinned, as Leonard Cohen would have it, between loneliness and holiness, extracted a terrible price for his discomfort, and continues to do so throughout the world. Catharism vanished from the West as a culture, but the literature of the troubadours survived. Within that literature lay the seeds of gentle love, seeds which might germinate at any time to spawn another Albigensian heresy. At first, the Church sought to eradicate the literary form itself, but this effort proved impossible. Rude Europe, barely awakened from the ugliness of the Dark Ages, petulantly refused to surrender a literary form which represented some small token of beauty. The Church then undertook to subvert the message of gentle love and to distort the ballads into courtly love, and that is the form in which this literature is studied today. Instead of the Cathar ideal of free women who could attain personal and spiritual completion, the poetry of courtly love presented women as objects to be won by the knight's prowess. Migrants not recorded and still unknown to archaeologists. Long-established empires crumbled under pressure from the newcomers. Even Egypt itself was invaded by another wave, the Hyksos, but Egypt recovered to regain its position of cultural dominance. It is contended that, at first, from the start of the migrations in 1500 BC until the final one about 450 AD, the migrants from the Caucasus reached the Mediterranean world in insufficient numbers to completely swamp the established Egyptian cultural influence. They trickled into the Mediterranean basin and were Egyptianized to a greater or lesser degree. This Egyptianizing process of cultural borrowing, it is believed, partially nullified the higher level of aggression common to these newcomers. Adopting some of the Egyptian pantheon, adopting variations in Egyptian dress, awed by Egyptian history and culture, and borrowing something of Egyptian lifestyle or civilization, these barbarians were at least partly tamed. As more migrants entered the Mediterranean world, however, Egyptian influence became increasingly diluted as some of the invaders borrowed secondhand from Western peoples who had arrived earlier. The ancient world was, then, a basically Egyptian construct. Mycenaeans, Minoans, Classical Greeks, and later Romans all represent varying, diluted degrees and interpretations of Egyptianization. There came a time, however, when the influx of Western migrants became too vast and the Egyptian impetus to the ancient world too attenuated and diluted to allow the newcomers to be absorbed and civilized. Like a life preserver of culture afloat for too long and buffeted by too many waves, the ancient world became saturated and sank beneath the incoming tide of Neanderthal Caucasoid characteristics. A fairly rigorous date can be placed on this event. It happened sometime between 378 AD and 450 AD. The handwriting was on the wall at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD when the Goths defeated the Romans. It was the worst disaster for Roman arms since Cannae more than half a millennium before. The Goths defeated the Romans not only by sheer numbers, but with a new weapon, heavy cavalry. Adrianople was the beginning of the truly Western world because with that battle the supremacy of the horseman was established, and with him a new social orientation and order. The feudal order and the social supremacy of the knight was born. Our modern West still bears vestiges of this ancient transition. Our words and titles for a man of standing reflect the male-dominated, patriarchal world of the Eurasian horseman, the knight. The French gentleman, or cavalier, was, originally, chevalier, a horseman. The Spanish still retain caballero, horseman, as their word for gentleman. The English sir was originally the feudal and patriarchal sire, the Italian messire the same. Along with the Gothic horseman came the Western emphasis on male power as reflected in the godhead, where, in the ancient world, the earth goddesses had been at least the equal of their divine male colleagues. With the coming of the horseman in force, male sky and war gods reigned supreme. This process of usurping female representation in the pantheon had, in fact, begun long before with the first Neanderthal Caucasoid invaders, but ancient Mediterranean beliefs remained powerful enough to negotiate a reasonably equal truce. In Greece, for example, where once the earth goddess enjoyed absolute primacy, after the coming of the Mycenaeans and Dorians, Hera became the wife of Zeus, Artemis the sister of Apollo. Among the Levantines, once all-powerful Ishtar was made to share her throne with Baal and Marduk. Only among the Jews and Arabs was the female principle almost entirely suppressed while the ancient world lived. Characteristically, the victory of Jehovah is considered a progressive move, but relics of an older order linger even within Judaism. During the Jewish feast of Purim, an ancient fertility feast commemorating the harvest and the generosity of the Earth Mother, pomegranates, a fruit sacred to the goddess, are much in evidence. And during this time of the revival of feminine power and identity, one can see automobile bumper stickers bearing the gentle reminder, mothers and daughters light Shabbos candles, a remembrance of the time when the holy days were sacred to females and the regenerative principle. Among the Semites, uniquely in the ancient world, female submersion occurred earlier and more completely than among other peoples. The anti-feminine taboos and injunctions within Judaism are particularly strong. Witness the frequent prayer of Semitic males, "Thank God I was not born a woman," or the Talmudic warnings against males being near a menstruating woman, or the ritual baths imposed against women following menstruation. Much of this anti-feminism was transferred to fledgling Christianity by St. Paul. It's better to marry than to burn. The converted Jew, Saul. Our institutionalized religions still bear witness. Since establishing his own identity, Western man has striven to explain and justify himself, to himself and to others, through the medium of his literature and art. As has been seen, the essentially alien and non-Western literary form of amour courtois proved so popular that, after the defeat of Catharism, the victorious church was forced to invent a superficially similar substitute, the poetry of courtly love. This somewhat bogus and artificial literary form became the foundation for the national literatures of the West, literature expressed not in the leftover language of Rome, but in the native tongues of European geography. The development of national and independent literatures gave Western man the opportunity to explain himself and express himself, but the results have not been wholly satisfactory. The evidence of literature and art reveals much about Western man, but not what Western man would have chosen to communicate. Just as the invented ballads of church-approved courtly love offered an unanalyzed thing called love, so the subsequently invented forms of Western literature have also relied on the theme of love, but without offering much insight into this powerful and mysterious force. Perhaps the characteristic Western literary form is the novel. Novels began to appear in the late 17th century, at about the same time that the colonial emphasis and impetus shifted from Southern Europe to Northern Europe, as Northern Europe was inventing industrialism. Novels were something new, as the name implies, and appeared on the cultural scene simultaneously with the equally new forms of expansion represented by industrialism and regimented warfare. It is almost as if novels appeared for the purpose of explaining and exploring Western man's motivations that seemed all the more puzzling because of the birth of much more efficient means of expansion, exploitation, and aggression. Industrialism, organized national armies, and new forms of commercial organization were giving rise to a new social order. The modern social order, in fact, in some way of accounting for this transition in the level of Western aggression seemed necessary. Novels were and are the answer, though an inadequate one. In novels, we have an artificial construct which is nonetheless presented as reality. Characters drawn as realistically as possible move and struggle within the plot. Novels are, in essence, like the modern computer model. They present possible alternative realities, possible scenarios, and by analyzing the responses of the characters, it is hoped and expected that some greater insight into our own real behavior in the real world may be gained. The novel is a medium of expression which is uniquely Western. No other people has ever troubled to invent such elaborately constructed pseudo-realities. Non-Western people have apparently failed to experience sufficient puzzlement about human motivation to bother writing novels. They have remained content with relatively simple chronologies for recording important historical and social information, while they have relied upon more or less fantastic stories for sheer entertainment. When literary insight into human motivation has been required, brief parables and fables, and even jokes, have sufficed. Nothing comparable to the novel has ever been invented in the pre-Western world. Only in the West has humanity felt compelled to create detailed and believable pseudo-realities, and only in the West has humanity analyzed the actions of completely fictional characters as if those actions in a make-believe world could be significant in yielding a greater understanding of the human condition. What has come to be called legitimate authors of serious fiction presume to think that their novels are, in fact, relevant. Legitimate and serious literary critics and literati agree with the author's basic premises. Literary creation and literary criticism enjoy such a predominant place in Western intellectualism that few Westerners, it seems, have stopped to consider the validity of the entire exercise. Some Easterners have, however. Although born to a Greek-speaking family, mystic George Gurdjieff was influenced from earliest youth by a Central Asian literary and philosophical orientation. Gurdjieff dismisses the entire body of serious Western fiction as wiseacre. For Gurdjieff, Western fiction is, simply, irrelevant. Similarly, although he is more polite about it, Sufi Idris Shah also dismisses most Western literature as irrelevant, except for some works by authors who were influenced by non-Western thought. These criticisms of our intellectualism may not be appreciated, but they deserve some thought. Maybe the best place to begin is to observe that all Western fiction of a serious nature deals with love in one way or another. The novel is a tale of love conquers all, a tale of love lost, a tale of love searched for, or, occasionally, a tale of the conflict between the pull of eros and the higher yearning for agape. All Western novels, without exception, are about love. Beings themselves has never obsessed the Oriental artist or people. Sexual difference was real and was to be refined, enjoyed and accepted as a normal part of natural life. But human sexual difference was never considered something either so mysterious or so compelling that it must intrude into the attempt to illustrate the harmony and condition of life. A butterfly on bamboo served better. If an analogy to our own Western confusion and concern about human sexual differences is sought, then a comparison of our art with that of primitives is forced. Among some peoples of Africa, Australian Aborigines, some Amerindian cultures, and the Polynesians, only within these primitive groups is a comparable obsession with the depiction of humans and human nudes found. And, as will be discovered later, only among primitives are sexual distortions of normal human physiology found comparable to the degree of sexual distortion achieved by Western fashions. Yet, as has been seen, all these primitive people migrated or were forced into areas of marginal physical and cultural survival. They have some excuse for cultural retardation, some excuse for an obsession with sex and reproduction. No such excuse exists, at least none has existed for the past several thousand years. The only excuse for sexual artistic obsession is that our psyches are constructed along anciently maladapted lines. Indeed, one of the objective wonders of the contemporary Western world must be that our technological development has allowed the artistic expression of very primitive psychosexual confusions in very sophisticated media. In terms of purely psychobiological analysis, there would appear to be little difference between Degas' series of bathing nudes and sub-Saharan fertility figurines or Bushman cave paintings. Only the medium of expression has evolved. The psyche of the creator has not. Degas had canvas and infinitely varied colors at his disposal. The primitive has only wood and an adze, or treasured containers of a few primary shades. The essential motivation, the psychosexual confusion, the attempt to understand the fact of female existence, and the threat it poses to male identity, all remain identical. Although no pretension to the status of an art expert is made in any way whatsoever, it may be germane to remark here that the return to primitiveness that characterized avant-garde Western art during the pre-World War II years, exemplified, perhaps, by the work of Modigliani and Picasso, was merely the unconscious realization that the motivations and confusions of Western man differ little from the orientation of primitive people even during a time of unparalleled technological development. Perhaps, in addition to the evidence of bone, it will be granted that a glance has at least been cast into the psyche of Western man and non-material indications of psychobiological maladaptation, and this in a society whose schoolbooks say that man is dominant because he has learned to control nature. The truth is that our attempts to control almost anything have reached a point of exceedingly diminishing returns. Our attempts to control other men are resulting in rebellion. Negroids in Africa and Mongoloids in China have acquired our own weapons and values in self-defense and are capable of turning them against us. Our attempts to control ourselves have resulted in governmental corruption and increasing crime rates. Our technology, which was once thought to control nature, is so complex that there is difficulty supplying it with fuel during a tough winter. Our attempts to control our own institutionalized aggression, our military, have been mocked by admissions by the U.S. Army that biological warfare research was conducted on civilian populations in major U.S. cities. All of these failures of control reflect progress getting out of hand. It can be seen that much of white man's progress is merely a vulnerable, dangerous vanity. Yet so deeply necessary is progress that President Carter, in his inaugural address, was forced to mouth obligatory phrases of moving forward. To what? As long as progress continues to be defined as increasing materialism, new inventions, improved production and developing technology, movement can only be toward eventual disaster. There are some who see solutions in new reserves of fossil fuels, cast an appreciative eye toward Canada and the North Slope of Alaska, and envision myriads of nuclear generating plants. But these are not solutions. They are postponements of an inevitable reckoning. There is not enough natural gas and oil either in Canada's Alberta fields or under the slope to supply growth projections for more than 20 years, if that long. Nuclear generating plants may be an answer, but at the appalling cost of producing long-lasting environmental poisons that we do not know how to dispose of. The U.S. is not the only exponent of Western progress and continued technological folly, as too many Canadian colleagues find it convenient to believe. Great Britain is banking its hopes on North Sea oil, which will not last forever, and then on nuclear power with even more acute disposal problems than North America faces. Canada, smug and self-righteous, supplies canned nuclear reactors to nations in conflict and extracts a promise that these nations won't make bombs. France and China indulge in open-air nuclear tests in the interest of catching up in nuclear technology. Go forward. Has anyone seriously considered going backward? There is inclination to agree with Ashley Montagu to a limited degree. Man does not seem to be absolutely compelled by biological determinants. But emphatic disagreement with Montagu must be expressed at the same time. It is extremely dangerous to accept uncritically, and too many mass-produced humanitarians have, what is called the Montagu pretension. It is generally agreed that man is born free of all those biological determinants which characterize the behavior of lower forms. Emphasis mine. To say that we are free of all biological determinants is dangerous vanity. Like Cyrano's, it may get us in the end. If the Montagu pretension is taken as an article of faith, there is no hope of dealing with some of our self-destructive tendencies. These tendencies can be dealt with, but they must be recognized for what they are first. Man's intelligence can override biological determinants, and there should be no fear of admitting the possibility that instinct may still influence us. It may influence us, but it does not need to control us. And it does not diminish man's stature to admit that he may not be completely beyond biology. Facing truth has never diminished anyone's stature, while courting vanity always has. Ironically, instinct will control us if the possibility of its influence is not admitted. A reasonable case has been made for the presence of biological determinants in man's behavior. The cause and the pattern have been outlined. Paintings testify that people swam and apparently developed the Australian crawl at that. More than one historian believes that the ancient Egypt we know was developed by people who collected along the Nile when the Sahara started to become desert about 5000 BC. If that is so, and it seems very likely, then there is reason to believe that the very first Egyptians were partially or even predominantly capoid. Some, after reaching the dependable source of water in the desert, the Nile, perhaps hesitated to settle down and relinquish the nomadic way of life they had had in the Sahara grasslands. Perhaps these capoids migrated on down the Nile, past the Great Lakes, and on into southern Africa, where they could live on the veldt in much the same manner as they had lived far to the north before the Sahara turned to sand. This scenario fits Kuhn's theory and the evidence. But whether or not this happened, it is undeniable that there was a definite capoid strain in the ancient Egyptians. Biasudi's Bushman-like skulls are one bit of evidence, but there are several more. The Hottentot apron, that unique elongation of the labia minora that distinguishes capoid women from all others, is also called the tablier Egyptian because the same anatomical adaptation has been observed in several female mummies. Then, those famous almond eyes of the Egyptians are nothing more nor less than an accurate representation of the almost oriental eye of modern capoids. About 6500 BC, a Caucasoid people, the Capsians, moved into the Nile area, but perhaps moved through is a better description of the evidence. There is little doubt that the Capsians came from Palestine because their Mesolithic blade and microlith culture had its origin there, but there are no Capsian sites in present-day Egypt itself. Capsian skeletal material and artifacts have been found in Tunisia and Algeria only, as far as is known. The evidence indicates a strong capoid presence in the Nile, through which the Capsian Caucasoid invaders may have forced or negotiated a corridor, but which they were unable to displace. Negative evidence proves nothing in paleontology, and it is possible that many Capsians settled in what was later to be Egypt. Later Egyptian art and history also testified to a strong Negroid admixture. The XXV dynasty was entirely Ethiopian, and statues of the great Mentuhotep, ca. 2133 to 1991 BC, who unified Egypt during troubled times, strongly suggest that he was a Negro. A bust of Queen Tyre, mother of famous Akhenaten, reveals marked Negro traits. Psychobiology in History and Society. A comparison of contemporary Western cultures with the Chinese and Egyptian civilizations will show that this aggression was also directed against men. Again, for a moment, ships will be discussed. In the ancient world, only the Western powers constructed specialized warships. The Egyptians and Chinese, for the most part, simply pressed merchant ships into military service in time of war. This is to say that neither the Chinese nor the Egyptians ever had a specialized navy as distinct from a merchant marine. This accounts for their singular lack of success against Western adversaries. The aggression of Chinese and Egyptians was apparently not so prominent, and therefore not so institutionalized. And while on the subject of ships, it might be germane to observe here that the entire philosophy of Chinese junks differs from the idea of a European vessel. The junk is designed to go with the sea and the wind, and not to strive against them. It is intended to offer little resistance, and to ride like a cork in a storm, while the European ship is designed to stand up to the wave and oppose the elements by sheer strength. This will be returned to a bit later. The Chinese and the Egyptians seem to have had a lower level not only of maritime aggression, but also of land-based aggression. In the broad view, neither of these non-Caucasoid powers made a habit of expansion. Rather, the reverse. Both considered themselves uniquely blessed and wished to remain isolated. There were periods of exception in the history of both peoples, but they were rare. On a more personal note, this Egyptian view of soldiering is offered. Come, let me tell thee of the woes of the soldier. He is awakened when an hour has passed, and he is driven like an ass. He works till the sun sets. He is hungry, his body is exhausted, he is dead while yet alive. And this was not a minority opinion. It was only one of several texts which schoolboys had to copy, which illustrated the non-glamour of war. As Barbara Mertz has said, these copy texts might be subtitled, "Why Not to Choose a Military Career?" One gets the impression that war was not considered a glorious or even very sensible occupation in ancient Egypt. True, gloomy and bombastic texts carved on steels recount the incredible exploits of various pharaohs on the battlefield. The number of enemy soldiers slaughtered is always astronomical, and the number of prisoners enslaved is all very impressive, except that some pharaohs simply copied earlier boastings of earlier pharaohs verbatim. The Egyptian ego did not demand individual recognition for heroic deeds on the battlefield, and one cannot help but think that the Egyptians were never keen on fighting. There were exceptions. Rarely. Thutmose III was an energetic campaigner and a reasonably successful one. So was Ramses II, but more by good fortune than sterling military qualities. In China, the Han dynasty was exceptionally expansionist. Both countries tended to rely on mercenaries whenever possible. Egypt preferred Aryans, Achaeans and Philistines, and Nubians about equally, while the Chinese regarded Manchurians as good war fodder. Both peoples learned to regret their military inadequacy. Both were, at one time or another, conquered by their own mercenaries, and both China and Egypt finally succumbed to highly motivated Caucasoid armies, which their mercenaries had no intention of opposing seriously. Perhaps it will be granted that Western cultures have differed from the Chinese and Egyptians in aggression, whether directed against man or nature. These peoples apparently did not share the Western emphasis on physical opposition and control. These peoples are conceived of as having been both unrealistic and unprogressive, and thus their cultural demise is accounted for. But, faced as the world is by the results of Western practicality and progress, perhaps the Egyptians and the Chinese deserve a closer look. It is believed that the Chinese and the ancient Egyptians progressed as much as the West has, but in a different direction, one offering few material remains. Rather than opposing or controlling nature through the use of mechanical contrivances, these civilizations placed a premium on refining and developing their relationships to nature and to each other. Some of their achievements, when reflected in material objects that have survived the ravages of time, are so subtle that there is difficulty recognizing them for what they are. The efficiency of these people is only now coming to be appreciated, but the man in the street is still largely unaware of new discoveries and recognitions. Ironically, it may be the progress won by this non-aggressive and harmonious worldview that can save Western civilization from its technological dead end. A return to the Chinese junk is desired in order to illustrate the kind of progress, in terms of psychology and worldview, that will be talked about. The junk is a unique material and functional creation which crystallizes philosophically the Chinese way of dealing with nature. And, as a solid entity of wood, canvas, and iron, the junk is a testament to an ancient technology that is only now being learned to be appreciated. Tabarly's creation meant less inertia and more speed in light airs. Weight is cost, not only in speed, but also in cost of construction and in potential payload not carried for any given size of boat. Tabarly's creation was neither revolutionary nor unorthodox, nor was it original with him. The principle of Penduic V's stability was the principle of the Chinese junk's stability. The principle is at least 3,000 years old. The Chinese did not indulge in ocean racing. They sought from their watercraft safety, economy in construction, efficiency, and, above all, carrying capacity. They were traders. The junk has all these qualities in large measure, and they derive, at least in part, from the rudder. The Chinese rudder extended very deeply into the water, and it angled forward. It was a curious appendage for their typically shallow draft hulls. This exceptional rudder could be raised and lowered to permit beaching or shoal cruising, but lowered fully it might extend as much as 12 feet below the keel on a 40 to 50-foot junk. If the illustration of Penduic V's keel tab is looked at carefully and compared with the Chinese rudder, it will be seen that they perform the same function. The junk rudder is not only a rudder, It is a lever using the force of the water flowing past to balance the force of the wind in the sails. But the comparison shows that the Chinese have been more economical. The junk's rudder takes the place of both the keel tab and the rudder on Pin Duick V. A balance of forces, not brute opposition to them, characterized the ancient junk. Tabarly's avant-garde and ultra-sophisticated Pin Duick V does not quite show a comparable level of refinement. While Tabarly the Frenchman was experimenting with the junk's underwater refinements, a British yachtsman, Colonel H.G. Blondie Hassler, was studying the Chinese sail rig, the batten lug. The elements of this rig have to be explained. All sails work on the same principle as an airplane's wing. An airplane's wing lifts because its shape causes a vacuum on the upper surface of the wing. The wing does not lift so much as the wing is pulled into the sky. A boat's sail works in the same way. A boat is not pushed by the wind. It is pulled along by a vacuum created in front of the sail, which results from the wind being stopped or distorted by the sail. The Western notion of the sail does not utilize the aerofoil principle very well because reliance is placed on the force of the wind itself to create a curve in the sail. Often, and especially in light airs, there is not enough wind to push the canvas into the most efficient aerofoil curve. The world's economy is dependent on international trade and comfort, and even survival relies upon the importation of goods, like oil for instance. Most of this trade is carried on by ships. Yet, ever-inflating energy economics are having a serious effect on maritime trade. Ships require fuel oil too, an immense amount of it in relation to the tonnage moved by a freighter or tanker. Water transport is only cheap if the motive power of ships is cheap. Otherwise, it becomes inordinately expensive. When ships were powered by sail, the motive power was free. Until recently, fuel was so cheap that steamships were not only viable, but actually cheaper than sail because of the volume of goods moved according to reliable schedules. Sailing ships died out because they couldn't compete with the economics of steam. But fuel costs are no longer a minor expense for the ship owner. Fuel is a major expense. The escalating cost of it is beginning to make the shipment of goods by steamship another exercise in diminishing returns. Not only that, but oil pollution is being recognized as a major environmental hazard. Most of the danger comes from cargoes of oil escaping, but escaping fuel oil from freighters and tankers contributes substantially to shore and open ocean oil slicks as well. Ironically, at the apex of our high-energy civilization, computer studies have shown that sailing ships are again becoming competitive, even taking into account the absolute unreliability of wind patterns. Wind ships could now, statistically, deliver goods cheaper than steam on an overall, worldwide basis. It was in response to these computer studies that Wilhelm Prols again turned to a computer to design a modern wind ship. The optimum size, number of masts, and sailing rig according to the computer, at any rate, resulted in Prols's design study. At first glance, this ship looks like a Western clipper, but a close look will reveal that the rig is actually a batten lug, the ancient Chinese junk rig. The sails of the Prols ship are more or less permanent fixtures. They never come down. They are plastic sheets which are curved to the optimum aerodynamic shape by aluminum battens. The sails are trimmed by rotating the entire mast, which is a tripod of aluminum tube. The masts are rotated by servo motors directed by a computer. In a storm, the sails can be trimmed to present almost negligible resistance to high winds. Computer studies have predicted that the Prols Neo Junk can average 25 days between Hamburg and Hampton Roads, carrying 13,000 tons of cargo with 10 less crew than a comparable modern motor ship. At a freight $1.50 less per ton than the minimum such a motor ship could accept with hope of payment. But that was back in 1958. The Prols design is much more competitive now. Fuel costs have tripled, labor has doubled, or more. Perhaps it is enough to say that 2 keels of Prols-like neo-junks have been laid in Hamburg, West Germany. Such length about junks has been gone into in order to show that on a very real and practical day-to-day basis the idea of refining natural relationships, rather than controlling nature by main force of technology, is the only true kind of progress. What is called progress is not practical because, as is beginning to be discovered, it is self-destructive and not environmentally supportable. With the lesson of the junk in mind then, preparedness to see other evidence of progress in Egyptian and Chinese civilization that has been ignored is perhaps present. And now that the outline of what will be found has been illustrated by the junk, as much time will not have to be spent on other progressive achievements which have more relevance to our crises. Western medicine is beginning to be aware that some diseases and conditions are apparently caused by disharmonies, which can be treated without drugs or surgery. Everyone knows that ancient Chinese acupuncture has earned some popular respect and even a modicum of Western medical acceptance. Less well known is the fact that color can have a marked effect on patients' rates of recovery and can even be used to treat some diseases. This was very familiar to the ancient Egyptians, who pioneered color therapy, and who seem to have designed some of their jewelry in an attempt to treat or correct individual disharmonies. In fact, gemstones were prized by the ancient Egyptians because of the pure colors they reflected, which were useful to health. Equally important to health were advances made in Egypt in the field of agriculture. The appeal of health foods in our society is a measure of concern over the chemical fertilizers and preservatives technology has invented in order to increase food production and facilitate distribution. It is beginning to be learned that, again, technology may be killing us. Consider some recent scientific discoveries. There are ancient myths from Egypt, China, India, and elsewhere involving the notion of plant growth being stimulated by music. Typically, some hero grows a luscious garden in short order by playing his harp, or else he sings up crops. Until the last decade, such myths were dismissed. Now, however, controlled experiments have shown that plants do respond to music, with some types of music promoting growth and other types stunting it. The implications for agriculture are obvious, but the research is still in its infancy. The appeal of the East to Western intellectuals tends to be the major attraction because of the natural, to a Westerner, idea that if technology and materialism represent an excess of sensation, then the cure must be asceticism. Our psychology is treacherous and self-protective. The asceticism that Western intellectuals find it easy to profess when taking up pre-technological philosophies was never characteristic of the societies from which borrowing is done. The civilizations of China, Egypt, and pre-Caucasoid India were not stable because of asceticism. They were stable, and perhaps more fulfilling than our own culture, because they were balanced, and because human temporal vanity and aggression were compensated for by sexual adaptation, leading to satisfying sexual behavior. Far from being ascetic, the civilizations of China, Egypt, and pre-Caucasoid India were highly erotic. They refined that too, as the West has very seldom done, and the irreverent thought is offered that Chinese, Egyptian, and pre-Caucasoid Indian civilizations owed their stability and humanitarian natural progress to sexual, sensual factors at least as much as they owed them to ascetic, esoteric intellectual ones. Since it is undeniable that primate sexual adaptation has been developed and refined in direct relation to the increase in intelligence and the cultural and technological ability to alter the natural world, culminating in man in both respects, and since Caucasoid sexual sensual maladaptation and cultural aggression in comparison with other races have already been discussed, it would seem that sexual sensual factors may be the most important. Sexual sensual adaptations seem to be a compensation for temporal aggression. In short, the species has become more sexy in direct proportion to the increase in intelligence and ability to conceive of time as a cultural environment. Caucasoids have a greater degree of temporal aggression, as reflected in wars against nature and man. This story was uploaded to YouTube by Ink and Panels Manawanis for recaps. If you're enjoying this story, please support us by becoming a subscriber and remember to press the like button.